Before my daughter, who had been missing for 10 long years, got married, I arrived at the venue still overwhelmed with emotion. Then the chef pulled me aside and whispered, "Hide, do not let them see you, trust me." I did not understand, but I listened. 10 minutes later, what I overheard exposed the entire conspiracy. I am Vernon, 72 years old, and this is the story of how I destroyed the people who tried to steal my daughter and my life. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to people who underestimated your worth based on the clothes on your back. Growing up in the Deep South meant survival was an everyday battle. I spent 40 years with engine grease permanently stained into the creases of my hands, working 16-hour shifts to build a life from absolute zero. I lived in a modest brick house in the historic West End of Atlanta, drove a battered 20-year-old truck, and wore suits that had seen better decades. To the outside world, I was just a quiet, retired black man living on a meager pension. That was exactly what I wanted them to think. True power does not need to shout, and invisible wealth is the ultimate shield. But my wealth could not protect me from a broken heart. 10 years ago, my only child, Maya, walked out of my house after a terrible argument. She was young, rebellious, and infatuated with a world I knew would chew her up. I tried to hold on too tight, and she slipped through my fingers. She vanished into the night, changing her number and cutting off all contact. For a decade, I lived in a silent purgatory. I hired private investigators, chased dead ends, and sat by the phone every single holiday. My wife Beatrice passed away 5 years into Maya being gone, her heart giving out from the stress and the sorrow. I was left completely alone. Then out of nowhere, a heavy cream envelope arrived in my mailbox. A wedding invitation. No handwritten note, no phone call to explain the missing decade. Just an elegant card stating that Maya Jenkins was marrying Preston Vance at the Grand Waldorf. I stood in the blindingly opulent lobby of the 5-star hotel, my heart hammering against my ribs. The crystal chandeliers above me looked like they cost more than a city block. I felt entirely out of place in my worn charcoal suit, surrounded by a sea of wealthy, predominantly white guests, dripping in designer gowns and bespoke tuxedos. The air smelled of expensive champagne and arrogant entitlement. I did not care about the judging whispers or the side eyes from the lobby staff. I was there for my little girl. Tucked inside my breast pocket was a cashier check for $10,000. It was a humble gift, a peace offering from a father desperate to make amends. I wanted to look like the man who had scraped together his life savings just to bless his daughter Union. As I navigated through the crowded hall toward the grand ballroom trying to catch a glimpse of Maya, someone bumped hard into my shoulder. I stumbled back, catching my balance. It was a young black man in a crisp white chef coat, desperately trying to steady a silver tray of appetizers. "I am so sorry, sir," he stammered, his eyes wide with panic. But as he looked at my face, the fear of dropping the tray shifted into a profound, paralyzing shock. "Mr. Jenkins," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Vernon Jenkins from the West End." I narrowed my eyes, studying his young, panicked face. I did not recognize him, but I knew his type. A hard-working kid from my neighborhood trying to survive in a place that probably treated him like the furniture. "How do you know my name, son?" I asked softly. He glanced around frantically, his eyes darting toward the ballroom doors to make sure no one was watching us. "I am Kobe," he said, the words spilling out in a desperate, hushed rush. "My little sister got the Beatrice Jenkins Memorial Scholarship last year. You paid for her entire college tuition. You saved my family from going under." I smiled, a genuine warm smile for the first time in years. "That is exactly what the fund is for, Kobe. Now, I do not want to hold you up from your job. I am just here to see my daughter get married." But Kobe did not smile back. Instead, all the color drained from his face. He dropped the silver tray onto a nearby service cart with a loud clatter, grabbed my arm with surprising strength, and pulled me toward a pair of swinging wooden doors. "What are you doing?" I demanded, trying to pull away. "I may be 72, but I am not a weak man, Mr. Jenkins, please," Kobe pleaded, his voice cracking with a raw terror that instantly put my survival instincts on high alert. "You have to come with me right now. Hide. Do not let them see you." I did not understand, but the sheer panic in his eyes told me he was not playing a game. He was warning me. I let him pull me through the swinging doors into a narrow, dimly lit service hallway, and then into a cramped storage pantry filled with sacks of flour and towers of expensive wine boxes. He locked the heavy wooden door behind us and turned off the overhead light, plunging us into near-total darkness. "Kobe," I whispered, my voice hard and commanding. "What is the meaning of this? I am here to see Maya. He leaned in close, his breathing ragged in the dark. They did not invite you here for a wedding, Mr. Jenkins. I have been working catering for this family all week. I hear things when they think the help is invisible to them. The groom, Preston Vance, and his parents, they have been talking about you. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. The Vance family. I knew the name well. They were a flashy real estate dynasty in Atlanta, famous for predatory lending, buying up distressed properties, and displacing the very people who built the neighborhoods. I had never dealt with them personally, but their reputation in the business world was ruthless and arrogant. However, street rumors suggested they were currently drowning in massive debt. What did they say? Kobe? I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy calm. Kobe swallowed hard. They are laughing at you, sir. They said you are some senile old fool sitting on a gold mine in the West End. They said today is not about Maya. It is about tricking you into signing everything away. Before Kobe could explain further, the heavy thud of footsteps echoed on the tile floor in the service hallway, stopping just outside our pantry door. Kobe clapped a hand over his own mouth and backed away into the shadows. I stood perfectly still, my heart pounding, my breath caught in my throat. I pressed my ear against the thin wood of the door. I cannot believe we are doing this here, Mom, a young man whined loudly. It had to be Preston, the man about to marry my daughter. His voice was smooth but dripping with privileged irritation. The press is out there in the lobby. If that old thug makes a scene, it will ruin the aesthetic of the whole wedding. A woman voice, sharp and laced with pure condescension, answered him. Oh, stop complaining, Preston. Do you think I want that dirty old man walking around my country club friends? Looking at that black girl wearing our family antique white dress is disgusting enough. But this is business. We need his signature on the trust documents today, or the bank is foreclosing on our entire commercial portfolio by Friday. But what if he refuses to sign? Preston asked, sounding genuinely panicked. What if he actually reads the transfer agreement? He thinks it is just a ceremonial blessing for Maya. A deep, authoritative man voice chimed in. Preston, father, no doubt. He will not read a damn thing, son. You spent 10 years isolating that girl, making her think her daddy abandoned her. He is going to walk in there overwhelmed with guilt, desperate to win back his little girl after a decade. You will play the white knight who brought their broken family together, and he will sign whatever you put in front of him out of sheer pathetic gratitude. We get his entire West End commercial district for free, use it as collateral to save our company, and tomorrow we throw the old man in a cheap nursing home. I stood in the dark pantry, the air suddenly turning to ice in my lungs. My fists clenched so tight my fingernails drew blood from my palms. 10 years. They had orchestrated this for 10 years. They had manipulated my daughter, intercepted her life, poisoned her mind against me, and now they were using her as bait to steal the land I bled for. I felt the $10,000 check in my pocket. It felt like an absolute joke now. I closed my eyes and let the grief of a father wash over me for exactly 5 seconds. Then I let it die. In its place, a cold, calculated rage took over completely. I was no longer a grieving father hoping for a tearful reunion. I was a predator who had just been invited into the den of thieves who thought I was an easy meal. They thought they were dealing with a broken, ignorant old man with a few rundown buildings. They had no idea that my simple life was a choice. They had no idea that I secretly owned the entire commercial district through a complex web of shell companies. They had no idea who Vernon Jenkins really was. The voices outside the door began to move away. Get back out to the ballroom, Preston, his mother snapped coldly. The bait is arriving any minute. Put on your best smile. We are about to be very, very rich. The footsteps faded down the hall until there was only silence. Kobe exhaled a shaky breath and turned to me in the dark. Mr. Jenkins, he whispered, his voice full of fear. What are you going to do? I adjusted my suit jacket, feeling the familiar heavy calm that had helped me survive the streets of Atlanta 50 years ago. I looked at the young man who had just handed me the key to my enemy's destruction. I am going to go to a wedding, Kobe, I said softly, and I am going to give them exactly what they asked for. I stood frozen in the dark pantry. The heavy smell of stored wine and dry flour filled my lungs. Next to me, young Kobe was trembling, holding his breath so tightly I could hear his heartbeat. Through the narrow crack in the heavy wooden door, a thin slice of light cut across the darkness. And through that crack, the voices of the Vance family drifted in, clear and poisonous. The mother spoke first. Her voice was sharp, polished by years of country club lunches, but underneath that polish was a rot so deep it made my stomach turn. I cannot stand looking at it anymore, she hissed. Seeing that black girl wearing our family antique white dress, the same dress my grandmother wore, it makes my eyes feel dirty. She does not belong in our world, Preston. She does not belong in this hotel. She is a street rat wearing a crown she did not earn. Every time she calls me mother, I have to suppress a gag. My hands grip the edge of a metal shelving unit in the dark. Maya was my princess. When she was a little girl, I used to buy her the prettiest dresses I could afford. I brushed her hair, told her she was beautiful, told her she could conquer the world. And now this woman was reducing my beautiful daughter to dirt, treating her like an infection in their so-called pure bloodline. The rage flared in my chest, hot and violent, but I forced myself to remain completely still. Preston let out a long, irritated sigh. "Just bear with it, Mom," he snapped. "Do you think I actually want to marry her? Do you think I want to spend the rest of my life explaining her to our board of directors? But you need to look at the bigger picture. Look at our bank statements. Our company is drowning. We are on the verge of total bankruptcy. The banks are ready to seize the mansion, the cars, everything. We will be out on the street by the end of the month." The father, whose heavy footsteps I had heard earlier, spoke up next. His voice was thick with arrogance and desperation. "Your son is right, Margaret. The Vance real estate empire is a house of cards right now. We over-leveraged on those luxury condos downtown and the market crashed. We need hard, unencumbered assets to use as collateral, or the creditors are going to tear us apart by Friday." "And that is exactly where old man Vernon Jenkins comes in," Preston said, his voice dripping with pure malice. "That stupid old mechanic has been sitting on the entire West End commercial district for decades. 6 prime commercial buildings. Do you know what developers would pay for that land? Millions. But the old fool refuses to sell to anyone. He just collects his little rent checks from those mom and pop stores and thinks he is a king. Today that ends." "How can you be so sure he will sign the papers?" Preston, the mother, asked, sounding anxious. "What if he brings a lawyer? What if he reads the contract?" Preston laughed. A cold, soulless laugh that echoed in the hallway and sent a chill straight down my spine. "A lawyer. Please. He is just a grease monkey who got lucky. He does not know the first thing about corporate trusts. I had our legal team draft a document disguised as a ceremonial wedding blessing. It is labeled as a contribution to the Vance Jenkins Family Trust. He thinks he is just signing a symbolic paper to welcome me into his family. But buried in the fine print is a total, irrevocable transfer of all his commercial deeds to my exclusive control. As soon as his pen hits that paper, the West End belongs to us. We take those deeds to the bank on Monday, secure a new line of credit, and save the company. And then we drop the girl and throw the old man in a state-run nursing home." The father chuckled. "It is brilliant, son. Truly brilliant. You are saving this family." But the mother still sounded paranoid. "I just worry about the girl. Maya has been asking about him lately. What if they start talking? What if they compare notes? What if she figures out what we are doing to her father?" Preston scoffed loudly. "They are not going to compare notes, Mom. I have spent 10 years making sure that never happens. Do you know how much work I put into breaking her down? When I first met her, she was so fiercely independent. She kept trying to call him. She kept writing him letters. My heart stopped beating. Letters. She wrote me letters." Preston continued, sounding incredibly proud of his own sickness. "I intercepted every single piece of mail she tried to send him. I blocked his number on her phone. I paid off the landlord at her old apartment to return his letters to sender. I spent a decade brainwashing her, telling her that her father was ashamed of her, that he never wanted to see her again because she ran away. I made myself the only person she could trust. I isolated her completely. She is completely dependent on me now. She thinks her father abandoned her." I closed my eyes in the dark pantry. The physical pain of hearing those words was worse than any injury I had ever sustained. For 10 years I had blamed myself. I thought my daughter hated me. Every night I prayed for her safety. I had walked to the post office in the rain, mailing letters that always came back stamped "Return to Sender." I had hired private investigators who always hit dead ends. And all this time my little girl was reaching out for me, and this monster was standing in the way, suffocating her, building a psychological cage around her mind. "So when he walks into that ballroom today," Preston went on, looking all sad and guilty, "she will think he is finally crawling back to beg for forgiveness. And he will be so desperate to win her back, he will do anything I suggest. I am the hero who reunited them. They are both eating out of the palm of my hand. I own them." The hallway went silent for a moment. Then the mother sighed softly. "Fine. Let us get this circus over with. Put on your smile, Preston. Let us go welcome the prey." Their footsteps moved away, fading down the hall toward the grand ballroom. The heavy double doors swung shut with a soft thud. In the dark pantry, the silence was absolute. Kobe was staring at me, his eyes wide with fear in the shadows. He had heard every word. He knew he was standing next to a father who had just discovered that the last 10 years of his life had been stolen by a group of wealthy racist thieves. I did not cry. I did not scream. Tears are for people who have lost hope. Screaming is for people who have lost control. I had neither lost hope nor control. I reached into my breast pocket and pulled out the crisp cashier check for $10,000. The peace offering. The humble gift from a broken father who just wanted to see his daughter smile again. I closed my fist around it. I squeezed until the paper crunched and folded, crushing it into a tight, worthless ball. Preston Vance thought he had found a prey. He thought he was playing a game of chess against an ignorant novice. But Preston made one fatal miscalculation. He judged a book by its cover. He saw my old suit, my calloused hands, and my quiet demeanor, and he assumed I was weak. He did not know that the hands that built engines also built empires. He did not know that the quiet old man he planned to rob was a silent shareholder in some of the most ruthless investment firms in Atlanta. He thought I was an old dog ready to be put down. I let the crushed check fall to the floor. The sadness that had haunted me for a decade evaporated instantly, replaced by a cold, calculating darkness. The silence of the devil had begun. I turned to Kobe. The young chef was still shaking, pressing his back against the wall. "Kobe," I said, my voice perfectly steady, completely devoid of emotion. "I need you to do exactly as I say. Go back to the kitchen. Act like you saw nothing. But keep your phone on you. When the time comes, I might need you to do something for me." Kobe nodded frantically. "Yes, sir. Anything you need, Mr. Jenkins. I got your back." I unlocked the heavy wooden door, pushed it open, and stepped out into the hallway. The bright lights did not blind me anymore. Everything was crystal clear. I adjusted my suit jacket and rolled my shoulders back. I was going to walk into that ballroom. I was going to hug my daughter. I was going to shake Preston's hand. I was going to smile at his arrogant, thieving parents. I was going to play the pathetic, grateful old man they fully expected me to be. I would let them set their trap. I would let them taste the victory. I would let them think they had conquered the West End. And then when they thought they had won, when they felt completely untouchable, I was going to burn their entire legacy to the ground. They wanted a wedding gift. I was going to give them a one-way ticket to total destruction. I pushed open the heavy double doors and stepped out of the service hallway, leaving the shadows behind. The moment the bright golden light of the grand ballroom hit my face, I began my transformation. I let my shoulders slump forward, rounding my spine just a fraction to mimic a man who had been beaten down by years of regret and hard labor. I allowed a slight rhythmic tremble to take over my hands. I was no longer Vernon Jenkins, the quiet titan who owned the ground these people walked on. I became exactly what they needed me to be. A broken, guilty, frail old man who had crawled out of his neighborhood to beg for scraps of forgiveness. The ballroom was a masterpiece of arrogant wealth. Crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting a warm glow over tables draped in imported silk. A string quartet played softly in the corner, almost drowned out by the chatter of 100 wealthy guests. They were all dressed in bespoke suits and designer gowns, a sea of privilege that stopped and stared as I shuffled down the center aisle in my worn charcoal suit. I could feel their eyes burning into me, full of pity and quiet disdain, but I kept my gaze fixed straight ahead. And then I saw her. Maya was standing near the sweetheart table, wearing an antique white lace gown that looked heavy and restrictive. My breath caught in my throat. It had been 10 years since I last saw my little girl. She was a grown woman now, strikingly beautiful, but there was a shadow in her eyes, a deep, lingering exhaustion that broke my heart. When she turned and finally saw me standing there, the champagne flute slipped from her fingers and shattered on the marble floor. "Dad," she whispered, her voice carrying over the sudden hush of the crowd. She ran to me, not caring about the heavy dress or the staring guests. When she crashed into my arms, she burst into tears, burying her face in my shoulder just like she did when she was a little girl, scared of a thunderstorm. I wrapped my arms around her, holding her tight. My own tears were real. The pain of missing her for a decade came flooding out. But as I stroked her hair, I poured all of my rage into the role of the guilty father. "I am so sorry, Maya," I whispered, letting my voice crack with fake shame. "I am so sorry I stayed away. I thought you did not want me. I thought I was not good enough for you anymore. I was giving her the exact narrative Preston had planted in her head. Maya sobbed harder, clinging to my jacket. No, Dad, she cried. I missed you every single day. I thought you abandoned me. Before I could comfort her further, a smooth, suffocating presence stepped into my peripheral vision. Preston Vance. He wore a pristine white tuxedo, his blonde hair perfectly styled, his smile radiating an engineered predatory warmth. He stepped up to us and placed a possessive hand on Maya, lower back gently but firmly, pulling her away from my embrace. There now, darling, Preston said, his voice loud enough for the nearby guests to hear. I told you I would bring him to you. I promised you we would heal this family, did I not? Maya looked up at him with tear-filled eyes, completely blinded by his manipulation. Thank you, Preston, she whispered. Thank you for finding him. Preston turned his attention to me. He extended his hand, playing the perfect benevolent savior in front of his wealthy audience. The wealthy white knight who had ventured into the inner city to rescue the poor, estranged black father and bring him into the light. Mr. Jenkins, he said smoothly, welcome. We are so incredibly glad you decided to show up. I reached out and took his hand. To the hundreds of guests watching, it looked like a beautiful moment of unity. But the second our palms met, Preston clamped his manicured fingers down with crushing, violent force. It was a power move, a silent, aggressive threat meant to establish dominance. He squeezed my knuckles, his eyes locking onto mine with a cold, dead stare that promised destruction if I stepped out of line. He was trying to hurt me. He was trying to make the frail old man wince in pain and submit. Inside my mind, I almost laughed. This arrogant boy had spent his entire life holding nothing heavier than a silver spoon and a crystal glass. He did not know anything about the 1970s in Atlanta. He did not know about the years I spent at the shipping docks hauling cinder blocks and rusted engine parts in the sweltering heat, working until my hands bled and blistered. I saved every crumpled dollar bill to buy my first piece of dirt in the West End. The bones in my hands had been tested by iron and concrete. My skin was armored with decades of thick calluses that no amount of expensive lotion could ever soften. Preston's soft, privileged grip felt like a child clinging to a stone wall. But I knew the absolute value of endurance. I knew that patience was the most lethal weapon a man could possess. So I gave him the victory he was so desperate for. I let my knees buckle just a fraction. I let out a small, breathless gasp as if his grip was overpowering me. I offered him a weak, trembling smile and lowered my eyes in total submission. Thank you, sir, I mumbled, forcing my voice to shake. Thank you for bringing my little girl back to me. I owe you everything. Preston smirked, his ego inflating to a monstrous size. He released my hand and patted my shoulder condescendingly. You do not owe me anything, Vernon. Just sit back, relax, and enjoy the celebration. We have a very special evening planned. He guided Maya back to the head table, leaving me to shuffle behind them. They seated me next to Preston's parents, Margaret and Richard Vance. They did not even bother to stand when I approached. Margaret offered me a tight, frozen smile that looked more like a grimace, pulling her expensive shawl tighter around her shoulders, as if my presence might infect her. Richard simply gave a curt nod and went back to sipping his scotch. I took my seat in silence, keeping my head down, playing the invisible, intimidated guest. For the next hour, I sat there and watched. I watched Preston control every interaction Maya had. I watched him order her food, dictate when she stood up, and steer her away from anyone who asked too many questions. It was a masterclass in psychological abuse disguised as attentive affection. My blood boiled, but my face remained an unreadable mask of elderly confusion. I ate my dinner slowly, waiting for the trap to spring. The moment finally arrived. The string quartet stopped playing. The low hum of conversation faded as Preston grabbed a silver spoon and clinked it against his crystal champagne flute. The sharp, high-pitched ringing commanded the attention of the entire ballroom. Preston stood up, adjusting his tuxedo jacket, and walked over to the main microphone on the small stage. He looked out over the crowd of wealthy investors, bankers, and socialites. Family and friends. Preston began, his voice echoing through the silent room. Today is about love. It is about two people coming together to build a legacy. But more importantly, today is about bridging divides. Today is about healing the past to secure the future. He gestured gracefully toward our table. As many of you know, my beautiful bride has been separated from her father for 10 long years. There were misunderstandings, regrets, and a lot of pain. But love conquers all. I made it my personal mission to find Mr. Vernon Jenkins and bring him here today to show him that he still has a family and that he will always be taken care of under the Vance name. The crowd erupted into polite, restrained applause. Margaret and Richard Vance smiled proudly at their son. Maya wiped another tear from her cheek, looking at Preston with total adoration. I kept my hands folded in my lap, letting my head drop as if overwhelmed by the generosity of his words. But healing the past requires more than just words. Preston continued, his tone shifting into something more formal, more businesslike. It requires action. It requires trust. And today Mr. Jenkins has decided to perform the ultimate act of trust. He has a very special wedding gift he wants to present to Maya and me right here in front of all of you. A gift that will unite our families forever. Preston looked directly at his parents. Right on cue, Margaret and Richard stood up from the table. Richard reached under his chair and pulled out a thick, heavy, leather-bound folder. He placed it directly on the table in front of me, sliding a gold-plated luxury pen right next to it. The entire ballroom was completely silent. Hundreds of eyes were staring right at me. The trap was set, the bait was in place, and the predators were waiting for the old fool to sign his life away. The silence in the grand ballroom was so profound that I could hear the hum of the air conditioning. Hundreds of pairs of eyes belonging to Atlanta wealthy elite were locked onto me. To them, I was a spectacle. A poor, broken black man making a desperate bid to buy back the affection of the daughter he had supposedly abandoned. Richard Vance tapped his perfectly manicured finger against the heavy leather-bound folder he had just slid across the white silk tablecloth. Right next to it lay a ridiculously thick, gold-plated pen. "Go ahead, Vernon," Richard whispered, his voice low enough that only our table could hear. "It is just a formality, a beautiful gesture for the kids." I looked down at the thick stack of papers. The title page was printed in bold, elegant lettering. The Vance Jenkins Family Trust. It sounded so noble, so unified. But I did not need my reading glasses to know what was buried beneath that fancy title. I had spent the last 30 years swimming in waters infested with corporate sharks much bigger than the Vance family. I knew exactly what a predatory contract looked like. This was an unconditional, irrevocable transfer of deeds. 6 prime commercial buildings in the historic West End. Buildings that housed generations of black-owned businesses, bakeries, barbershops, and bookstores. The lifeblood of my community. The exact community the Vance family was known for bulldozing to build luxury high-rises for people who looked just like them. And Preston wanted me to hand it all over to him absolutely free of charge, wrapped in a wedding bow. Preston stood at the microphone, his pristine white tuxedo catching the spotlight. He smiled that engineered, practiced smile. A father blessing. Preston announced to the crowd, his voice smooth as silk. A gift that ensures our family legacy will be united and prosperous for generations to come. Let us give Mr. Jenkins a moment to finalize this beautiful union. The crowd murmured in approval. Margaret Vance, sitting to my left, let out a soft, impatient sigh. She leaned in closer, the smell of her expensive floral perfume masking the stench of her greed. "Do not keep them waiting, Vernon," she whispered coldly. "You owe her this. You owe us this for stepping up when you walked away." I slowly lifted my head and looked at Maya. My beautiful daughter was sitting at the sweetheart table, her hands clasped tightly together. Her eyes were wide, filled with a desperate, fragile hope. She had been brainwashed for 10 years. Preston had meticulously convinced her that I was a deadbeat, that I had rejected her, and that this grand public gesture was the only way I could ever prove my love. She thought I was signing a ceremonial promise to be part of her life again. She had no idea she was watching a daylight robbery. Looking at her tear-filled eyes, I felt a familiar burning ache in my chest. It took every ounce of strength in my body not to flip the table and wrap my hands around Preston's throat. But I did not let the anger show. Instead, I used the pain. I let my lower lip tremble. I blinked rapidly, forcing the moisture to gather in my eyes until a single thick tear escaped and rolled down my weathered cheek. I raised a shaky hand and wiped it away clumsily. I let out a heavy, ragged sigh, playing the part of a man completely overcome by guilt and gratitude. I looked at Maya and mouthed the words, "I am so sorry." She covered her mouth, a sob escaping her lips. It was a beautiful, tragic scene. The audience was practically holding its breath. I reached out with a trembling hand and picked up the gold-plated pen. It felt heavy and cold. My calloused, scarred fingers wrapped awkwardly around the smooth metal, acting as though I had never held a luxury writing instrument in my life. I hovered the tip of the pen over the dotted line on the final page. Richard Vance leaned forward, his breathing suddenly shallow. I could practically hear him salivating. He was watching his salvation. He was watching the end of his impending bankruptcy. The Vance real estate empire was drowning in debt, and the ink in my pen was the only life raft they had left. But the Vance family made a fatal mistake. They assumed I was just an uneducated mechanic who had inherited some lucky real estate. They did not know that for the past 3 decades I had employed teams of the sharpest corporate attorneys in the state. They did not know that Vernon Jenkins never did business under his own personal name. I operated through a massive, complex labyrinth of shell companies holding groups and anonymous trusts. I pressed the pen to the paper. I did not sign Vernon Jenkins, managing director of West End Holdings. I signed a slightly misspelled, sloppy version of my personal name. And then I did something that made Richard Vance raise an eyebrow, but only for a second. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a small, worn brass ink stamp. Next to my signature. The red ink bloomed next to my signature. The red ink bloomed on the crisp white paper. It read Jenkins Auto and Parts Incorporated. Richard Vance relaxed, letting out a soft chuckle of amusement at the old man's antiquated ways. He thought it was just the pathetic, nostalgic gesture of a retired grease monkey stamping his little mechanic shop logo on a multi-million-dollar corporate trust. What Richard did not know was that Jenkins Auto and Parts Incorporated was a shell company that I had legally, completely, and permanently dissolved 30 days ago. The entity did not exist. The signature was intentionally mismatched. The corporate seal was dead. I had just signed a legally binding document using the identity of a ghost. The contract sitting on that table was not worth the ink it was printed with. It was an absolute piece of garbage. But to them, it was a golden ticket. I set the pen down. I pushed the folder back across the silk tablecloth. Before the folder even stopped sliding, Richard snatched it up with lightning speed. He did not even bother to check the pages. He snapped it shut and handed it to his wife. Margaret clutched the folder to her chest, her tight grimace finally breaking into a massive, genuine smile of pure, unrestrained greed. She picked up her crystal glass of champagne and took a long, victorious sip. At the microphone, Preston beamed. He raised his glass to the crowd. To family, he declared. To family, the wealthy crowd echoed, raising their glasses in unison. The polite applause washed over the ballroom again. Maya stood up, navigating her heavy white dress around the tables, and threw her arms around my neck. I hugged her back, burying my face in her shoulder. She smelled like the same little girl I used to read bedtime stories to, but her frame felt so small, so fragile under the weight of the lies she had been fed. Over her shoulder, my eyes locked with Preston. He was staring at me from the stage. He raised his glass directly to me, a sickening, triumphant smirk plastered across his face. He thought he had just robbed a blind man. He thought he had just secured his dynasty and conquered my life work without breaking a single sweat. He thought he had won. I kept my face hidden in my daughter's embrace, but in the shadows my own smile formed. A cold, terrifying smile. They thought they were holding the keys to a multi-million-dollar empire. They had no idea they were holding a completely useless piece of paper. But that useless piece of paper had just given me exactly what I needed. It gave me 48 hours. 48 hours before the banks opened on Monday morning and they realized they had nothing to show their creditors. 48 hours to strip them of their wealth, their pride, and their freedom. The trap had successfully snapped shut. And now the hunt was officially on. The grand ballroom slowly began to empty as the night wore on. The string quartet had packed up their instruments, and the clinking of crystal glasses gave way to the tired shuffling of hotel staff clearing tables. The heavy scent of spilled wine, expensive perfume, and melting wax candles hung thick in the air. I sat quietly in my corner, playing the part of the exhausted, overwhelmed old man perfectly. I kept my head bowed, sipping a glass of water, watching the wealthy guests stumble toward the exits. Through the thinning crowd, I spotted Maya. She was sitting alone at the sweetheart table for the first time all evening. Her shoulders were slumped, and the heavy antique white dress looked like it was weighing her down physically and spiritually. She was staring blankly at the floral centerpiece, her eyes distant and tired. My heart ached for her. I just wanted 2 minutes alone with my daughter. I wanted to look into her eyes, hold her hands, and plant a single seed of doubt in her mind about the family she had just married into. I wanted to tell her that I had never stopped looking for her. I leaned heavily on the table, putting on my best performance of a frail elder, and slowly made my way across the marble floor. I was only 10 feet away from her when a solid, immaculate wall of white fabric stepped directly into my path. Preston Vance blocked my way, his arms crossed over his chest. His engineered smile was completely gone. Now that the contract was signed and the important guests were leaving, there was no need to keep up the charade. His eyes were cold, flat, and filled with absolute disdain. "Where do you think you are going, Vernon?" Preston asked, his voice low and dripping with condescension. "I just wanted to say goodnight to my daughter," I replied softly, letting a slight tremor enter my voice. I wanted to tell her how beautiful she looked today. Preston scoffed, a short, ugly sound of amusement. He stepped closer, invading my personal space, towering over me with the unearned confidence of a boy who had never been punched in the mouth. "She is exhausted," he said, treating me like a stray dog that had wandered too far into his yard. "It has been a long day, and she does not need to be burdened by your emotional baggage right now. You played your part, old man. You signed the paper. You gave the cameras a good show. Your job here is done. You should leave before you overstay your welcome." I looked up at him, letting my eyes widen slightly as if his harsh words had wounded my fragile pride. "Are you telling me I cannot speak to my own flesh and blood?" I asked, keeping my tone submissive and pleading. Preston leaned in so close I could smell the expensive scotch on his breath. "She is a Vance now," he whispered venomously. "She belongs to me. You do not get to walk back into her life just because you showed up in a cheap suit and signed a piece of paper. Go back to your neighborhood, Vernon. Do not call us. We will call you when we need you to empty out your house." I held his gaze for 3 long seconds. I memorized the arrogance in his blue eyes. I memorized the smirk on his face. I memorized the exact tone of his voice. I took all of it and buried it deep inside the furnace of my chest. "You are right, sir," I mumbled, lowering my head in total defeat. "It is late. I will find my own way out. Congratulations on your marriage." Preston chuckled, turning his back on me without another word. He walked over to Maya, grabbed her gently but firmly by the upper arm, and pulled her out of her chair to lead her away. She looked back at me over her shoulder, her eyes full of confusion and sorrow, but she did not resist him. I turned around and walked toward the grand lobby. I kept my shoulders rounded and my steps short and uneven. I walked past the valets, past the doormen in their pristine uniforms, and stepped out into the cool, crisp Atlanta night air. The moment the heavy glass doors closed behind me, the transformation happened. I straightened my spine, my shoulders squared. The fake tremor in my hands vanished completely. I took a deep breath of the city air, feeling the blood rush through my veins with a cold, terrifying clarity. The frail, pathetic Vernon Jenkins ceased to exist on that sidewalk. The Titan of the West End had returned. I walked away from the glaring lights of the hotel, stepping into the shadows of a quiet side street. I reached into my jacket pocket, pulled out my phone, and dialed a number I knew by heart. The phone rang twice before a deep, resonant voice answered. "Good evening, Mr. Jenkins," the voice said. Desmond. He was 45 years old, a brilliant, ruthless corporate attorney, and one of the most feared legal minds in Georgia. When Desmond was a teenager, his father lost his home and his business to a predatory lending scheme run by people exactly like the Vance family. I saw the fire in that boy's eyes. I paid for his undergraduate degree and I paid for his law school. I unleashed him into the corporate world like a guided missile, and he had been my most loyal weapon ever since. "Desmond," I said, my voice hard and steady. "The trap is set. They took the bait. I signed the dummy contract with the dissolved shell company. They think they own the West End." I heard Desmond chuckle on the other end of the line, a dark, rich sound of pure anticipation. "I hope they popped a nice bottle of champagne to celebrate their imaginary victory," he said. "So what is our next move, sir?" "I want to initiate the total destruction of the Vance Group," I commanded, walking briskly down the empty street. "I want you to mobilize the entire team tonight. Dig up every single piece of financial dirt you can find on Richard and Preston Vance. I want to know about every shadow loan, every over-leveraged mortgage, every favor they owe to the criminal underworld, and every drop of toxic debt keeping their company afloat." "Consider it done," Desmond replied. The amusement gone from his voice, replaced by absolute professional lethality. "But buying up that much commercial debt in a weekend is going to require massive liquidity. Mr. Jenkins, we are talking about millions of dollars in aggressive acquisitions. Use Onyx Capital," I told him. "Empty the reserve accounts if you have to. I do not care what premium you have to pay the private lenders to sell us their debt. By Monday morning, I do not just want to be a thorn in their side. I want to be the sole owner of their entire financial existence. When they wake up from their wedding hangover, I want them to realize that I hold the leash to their family legacy. You will have the portfolio by Sunday night," Desmond promised. "I will call you when the first domino falls." I hung up the phone and kept walking until I reached the public parking garage several blocks away. My battered 20-year-old pickup truck was parked in the corner, looking completely out of place in a city full of luxury sedans. I unlocked the door, climbed inside, and gripped the worn leather steering wheel. The silence of the truck cabin was heavy. I looked at the empty passenger seat, thinking about my late wife, Beatrice. I remembered how she used to hold my hand when things got tough. I remembered her crying over Maya's empty bedroom. Beatrice never got to see the people who stole our daughter. She never got to see the monsters who convinced our child that she was unloved. I made a silent promise to the ghost of my wife. I was going to tear the Vance family apart brick by brick, dollar by dollar. I started the engine. The old truck roared to life, a rough, powerful sound that mirrored the storm brewing inside me. I was about to put the truck into gear when my phone suddenly vibrated on the passenger seat. It was an unknown number. I frowned, letting it ring for a moment before picking it up. "Hello," I answered. "Mr. Jenkins," a hushed, trembling voice whispered through the speaker. "It is Kobe, the chef from the pantry." "Kobe," I said, instantly alert. "Are you all right, son? Why are you whispering?" "I am hiding in the service stairwell," Kobe said, his breathing frantic and shallow. "I did what you said. I acted like I did not know anything. I stayed late to help the cleaning crew clear out the bridal suites. Preston and Maya went down to the ballroom for the after-party, but they left their private suite unlocked. I know I should not have done it, Mr. Jenkins. But I went inside. I went looking for something. Anything." "What did you find, Kobe?" I demanded, gripping the steering wheel tighter. "I went through the trash can in Preston's private dressing room." Kobe continued, his voice cracking with pure terror. He had thrown away a bunch of old files and folders to make room for his wedding gifts. "Mr. Jenkins, I found a notebook. A thick, red leather notebook." My stomach dropped. "What is in the notebook, son?" "It is a ledger." "Mr. Jenkins, it is entirely in Preston handwriting. It is a daily log of everything he has done to your daughter for the past 10 years. He documented all of it. How he hacked her email accounts, the names of the private security guys he hired to follow her so she would never run into you. He even wrote down the exact dates he bribed her old landlords to throw away your letters." The air vanished from the cabin of my truck. The sheer psychopathic level of control this boy had exerted over my daughter was beyond greed. It was an obsession. It was an evil so profound it defied human logic. "There is something else," Kobe whispered, and I could hear the sound of approaching footsteps echoing through the phone from his end. At the very back of the notebook, he wrote down a plan for what he is going to do to Maya after they secure your property on Monday. "Mr. Jenkins, he is not just planning to divorce her. He is planning something much, much worse. I have to go. Someone is coming. I will bring the notebook to your house tonight." The line went dead. I sat in the idling truck, the phone pressed against my ear, listening to the dial tone. A new kind of darkness washed over me. This was no longer just about real estate money or bruised pride. This was about the survival of my only child. Preston Vance had just signed his own death warrant, and I was going to be the executioner. I drove my truck through the quiet streets of the West End and parked behind one of my commercial buildings. The night air was thick and humid. 10 minutes later, a battered sedan pulled into the dark alleyway. The headlights flicked off and young Kobe stepped out into the shadows. He looked completely terrified. He was clutching a brown paper bag against his chest like it was a live grenade. I stepped out of my truck and met him halfway. He handed me the bag with shaking hands. Inside, I could feel the heavy weight of the red leather notebook. I looked the young chef in the eye and told him to go home, lock his doors, and call in sick for the rest of the week. I assured him that he had just done a very brave thing, and that I would personally guarantee his safety and his future career. I watched him drive away before I climbed back into the dark cabin of my truck to face whatever nightmare was waiting for me inside that bag. I turned on the small overhead dome light and pulled the thick notebook from the paper bag. The red leather cover was expensive and smooth. I flipped it open. The pages were filled with the arrogant, looping handwriting of Preston Vance. I started reading from the beginning, and with every page I turned, my blood grew colder. It was not just a diary. It was a meticulous operational log of psychological torture. Preston had treated my daughter like a project to be dismantled and rebuilt for his own amusement. I read the entry from 7 years ago where he admitted to hacking into her social media accounts to alienate her from her college friends. He documented how he needed to cut off her entire support system so she would have no one else in the world to turn to. He paid her roommates to start vicious rumors about her, causing her to drop out of her sorority. But the most devastating pages were the ones concerning me. There were detailed logs of every single letter Maya had written to me over the years. He intercepted every one of them from the mailroom. In the margins of his notebook, he bragged about writing fake letters back to her. He had forged my handwriting. He wrote cruel, unforgivable things to my little girl. He wrote that she was a disappointment and that I never wanted to see her face again. He documented how she cried for days in their apartment after receiving those fake rejection letters. He wrote about how he sat there holding her, wiping her tears, and pretending to be her only comfort in a cold, rejecting world. He even hired 2 local street thugs to stage a fake mugging in a dark parking lot just so he could swoop in, fight them off, and play the hero. He engineered her trauma from the ground up just so he could be her absolute savior. My hands began to shake so violently that the notebook almost slipped from my grasp. The sheer level of sociopathic evil required to systematically break down a young woman's mind was staggering. Preston Vance was not just a greedy real estate developer looking for a payday. He was a predator who had kept my daughter hostage in a mental prison for a decade. I wanted to put my truck in gear drive straight to his luxury hotel suite, kick the door off its hinges, and break every bone in his privileged body. I wanted to make him feel a fraction of the terror he had inflicted on my child. But raw violence is a poor man weapon. Wealth strategy and absolute patience are the tools of true destruction. I forced myself to breathe in the stale air of the truck cabin. I closed the red notebook and placed it gently on the passenger seat just as my phone began to vibrate. It was Desmond, my attorney. I answered the call and his voice came through sharp and strictly business. "Mr. Jenkins," he said, "I have the full financial dossier on the Vance Group. You were entirely correct. They are bleeding out from every major corporate artery. Richard and Preston Vance do not just owe money to traditional banks. They overextended themselves on a massive luxury development project 3 years ago, and it failed spectacularly. To keep their lifestyle afloat, they borrowed heavily from the shadow banking sector. We are talking about $15 million in toxic high-interest debt. And they did not borrow this money from friendly corporate lenders. They took capital from unregulated private equity funds that operate as legitimate fronts for the criminal underworld. People who ruin lives and break families when they do not get their money back." Desmond paused, letting the heavy gravity of those numbers settle over the line. "They are desperate, Mr. Jenkins. They have a hard concrete deadline. The shadow lenders are demanding full repayment by this Friday at noon. If the Vance family cannot produce $15 million in cash or secure hard collateral by then, those lenders are going to seize their personal assets, their mansion, and their company. That is exactly why they needed your West End properties today. They plan to march into their primary bank on Friday morning, use your commercial deeds as collateral to secure a massive corporate loan, and pay off the criminal syndicate before the clock runs out." I stared out the windshield into the dark, empty alleyway. Today was Wednesday. The wedding had given them the false sense of security they desperately needed to sleep at night. They thought they had secured the collateral. They thought they had successfully outsmarted the poor black mechanic from the south side of Atlanta. They had absolutely no idea that the contract they were holding in their hands was a legally void piece of trash stamped with a dead company seal. But more importantly, they had no idea that I was already moving to cut off their oxygen supply completely. "Desmond," I said, my voice dead calm in the quiet truck, "I want Onyx Capital to buy every single cent of that $15 million debt tonight. Contact the shadow lenders immediately. Offer them a 10% premium to sell the paper to us right now. I want to hold the exclusive rights to the Vance family financial survival before the sun comes up." Desmond did not hesitate for a single second. "I will have the acquisition paperwork finalized before dawn," he promised. "But Mr. Jenkins, buying their debt makes you their primary legal creditor. When they fail to secure the bank loan on Friday because of your fake contract, they will default directly to you. What exactly do you want to do to them when that happens?" I looked over at the red notebook sitting on the seat next to me in the dark. I thought about the 10 years of tears my beautiful daughter had shed. I thought about the arrogant smirk on Preston's face when he told me to go back to my neighborhood. "I want to leave them with absolutely nothing," I replied smoothly. "I want to take their company, their mansion, their cars, and their reputation. I want them to feel the exact same total isolation they forced upon my daughter." I hung up the phone and turned the ignition key. The engine roared to life in the empty alley. The clock was officially ticking. I had exactly 48 hours to execute the most ruthless financial takeover in Atlanta history. I had 48 hours to turn the mighty Vance family into penniless beggars before they could even step foot inside a bank. The hunt was accelerating, and I was not going to stop until there was nothing left of them but ashes. People look at me, and they see history. They see a tired old black man who survived the Jim Crow South, who worked in a hot garage smelling of motor oil, and who drinks cheap coffee on a rusted front porch. That is exactly what Richard and Preston Vance saw when they looked at me. They saw a convenient stereotype. They saw an uneducated victim. They did not know that 40 years ago I realized that owning a mechanic shop was simply not enough. You had to own the land it sat on, and then you had to own the bank that financed the land. I started Onyx Capital in the late 1980s with 3 other black businessmen who were sick and tired of being denied commercial loans by white bankers in downtown Atlanta. We pooled our money. We bought distressed commercial real estate in forgotten neighborhoods. We grew quietly and ruthlessly. Over the decades, my partners either passed away or cashed out, leaving me as the anonymous sole majority shareholder of a private equity firm that controlled hundreds of millions of dollars in liquid assets across the state of Georgia. I did not buy flashy sports cars. I did not move to a gated mansion in the wealthy white suburbs. I stayed in my modest brick house in the West End because I never needed validation from the kind of people I could buy and sell before breakfast. Thursday morning arrived with a heavy thunderstorm washing the streets of Atlanta clean. I sat at my worn kitchen table drinking black coffee and staring at the red leather notebook Preston had used to document my daughter's psychological torture. My phone rang at exactly 8 in the morning. It was Desmond, my attorney. He sounded exhausted but incredibly triumphant. He had spent the entire night negotiating with the shadow lenders who held the Vance family toxic debt. These were not men who wore tailored suits to corporate board meetings. These were dangerous, ruthless men who operated in the criminal underworld, men who broke legs and ruined families when they did not get paid on time. But even monsters respect cold, hard cash. Desmond told me that Onyx Capital had successfully transferred $18 million to secure the debt, paying a massive premium to convince the criminal syndicate to sell the paper to us immediately. The digital ink was dry, the paperwork was legally binding, the shadow lenders were completely out of the picture. As of 8:15 on Thursday morning, Vernon Jenkins, operating under the impenetrable shield of Onyx Capital, was the sole owner of the Vance Group massive debt. I owned the mortgage on their towering glass corporate headquarters. I owned the aggressive liens on their luxury vehicles. I owned the deed to their sprawling multi-million-dollar estate in Buckhead. They were no longer a powerful real estate dynasty. They were my indentured servants. I took a slow sip of my coffee and looked around my simple kitchen. The linoleum floor was scuffed from decades of footsteps. The refrigerator hummed a noisy, familiar tune. I thought about Richard and Margaret Vance waking up in their silk sheets, probably nursing a hangover from expensive wedding champagne, believing they had just saved their corrupt empire. I thought about Preston waking up next to my daughter, believing he was the smartest predator in the city. They truly thought the piece of paper I signed at the wedding reception was their golden ticket. They did not know it was stamped with a dead company seal and was completely legally worthless. And they absolutely did not know that while they were sleeping off their arrogant celebration, an old black mechanic from the South Side had just purchased their entire existence. The trap was no longer just set. The steel jaws had snapped completely shut, and the Vance family was already bleeding out. They just had not felt the terrible pain yet. The day stretched on as I prepared the final stages of my retaliation. Thursday evening approached, and the heavy rain finally stopped, leaving a thick, humid stillness in the southern air. I was sitting on my porch watching the neighborhood kids ride their bikes down the cracked sidewalks when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Preston Vance. I took a deep breath, burying my raging fury deep down in the furnace of my chest, and answered the call. "Hello?" I said, keeping my voice low and deliberately submissive. Vernon Preston snapped, completely dropping the charming son-in-law act he had played for the cameras at the wedding. His voice was sharp, entitled, and dripping with pure, unchecked arrogance. "Listen to me very carefully, old man. Tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, my family is holding a massive press conference right in the middle of your precious West End. We have invited the mayor, the city council, and every major news network in Atlanta. We are officially announcing the Vance Jenkins redevelopment project. We are going to tell the entire city how we plan to bulldoze your rundown little neighborhood and bring some actual high-class civilization to that miserable area." I gripped the armrest of my wooden porch chair so hard the wood groaned. Bulldoze the neighborhood. They were planning to erase my community, the legacy of my people, the very businesses that kept our families fed, and they wanted to do it on live television. I did not say a single word, letting him continue his arrogant, disgusting monologue. "You are going to be there," Vernon Preston commanded, his tone turning completely venomous. "You are going to put on a clean suit. You are going to stand on that stage right behind my parents, and you are going to smile for the cameras. You are going to tell the press how incredibly grateful you are that the Vance family stepped in to save your failing community. You are going to play the role of the thankful saved minority. And if you even think about causing a scene, if you say one wrong word or step out of line, I promise you will never lay eyes on Maya again. I will move her entirely out of the state, and I will make sure she believes you abandoned her all over again. I will break her mind completely. Do you understand me?" The sheer audacity of his threat echoed in my ear. He was holding my only child hostage, using her as psychological leverage to humiliate me on my own territory. He wanted to parade me around like a conquered animal, a quiet, obedient trophy for his wealthy white investors to admire. He wanted me to applaud my own destruction. I thought about the red notebook sitting on my kitchen table. I thought about the $15 million of his unpayable debt currently sitting locked inside my corporate portfolio. I let a slow, dark, terrifying smile spread across my weathered face. I understood him perfectly. "I understand, Preston," I replied, making sure my voice sounded properly defeated and broken. "I will not cause any trouble for your family. I will be there right on time." "Good boy," Preston sneered, letting out a dry, cruel laugh before the line went dead. I slowly lowered the phone from my ear. I looked out at the street, watching the sunset paint the Atlanta sky in dramatic shades of bruised purple and blood red. Preston Vance wanted a show. He wanted a massive public spectacle to announce his grand absolute victory over the weak old man. I was going to give him exactly that. But tomorrow morning the news cameras were not going to broadcast the triumphant rise of the Vance empire. They were going to broadcast a brutal public execution. Friday morning arrived with a suffocating heavy southern heat. I drove my battered 20-year-old truck into the heart of the West End and parked 2 blocks away from the community square. This was my neighborhood. I knew every single crack in the pavement. I knew the families who ran the bakeries, the barber shops, and the small grocery stores. Generations of Black Americans had built this sanctuary with their own blood and sweat, and now the Vance family had invaded it. They had erected a massive, glaringly white canopy right in the middle of the historic plaza. It looked like an alien spaceship dropped directly into our community. Satellite trucks from every major news network in Atlanta were parked along the curb. Caterers in crisp white shirts were handing out expensive sparkling water to city council members, local politicians, and wealthy corporate investors. The sheer audacity of the entire spectacle was sickening. They were treating my home like a conquered territory, setting up a throne room on the very ground they planned to bulldoze. I walked toward the VIP seating area, deliberately keeping my shoulders slumped and my head bowed. I was wearing the exact same faded gray suit I had worn to the wedding. I wanted to look like the defeated, pathetic old man they fully expected to see. As I approached the front row, my eyes immediately locked onto Maya. My heart physically ached inside my chest. She was sitting in a stiff, restrictive designer dress that clearly belonged to her mother-in-law taste. She looked utterly exhausted. The vibrant, fiercely independent girl I had raised was buried under heavy makeup and a hollow, terrified stare. Margaret Vance sat directly next to her. I watched as Maya reached out a trembling hand for a glass of water on the table. Margaret sharply slapped Maya's hand away, hissing something venomous into her ear with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. Maya flinched violently, pulling her hand back and lowering her eyes to her lap in total submission. My jaw locked so tight my teeth threatened to crack. They were treating my daughter like an unwanted prisoner. They paraded her around to claim a false progressive connection to my community while treating her like absolute dirt the moment they thought no one important was looking. I took all of that rage and pushed it down into the furnace burning in my gut. The press conference officially began. Richard Vance stepped up to the podium first. He adjusted his imported silk tie and smiled his $1,000,000 smile at the flashing cameras. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice echoing off the historic brick buildings I secretly owned. "Today we bring the light of modern civilization to a forgotten corner of Atlanta. For too long this area has suffered from urban blight, poverty, and a lack of sophisticated vision. We look at these old, decaying structures and we see a blank canvas. We see luxury high-rises, boutique shopping, and high-end dining." He used all the polished corporate buzzwords to mask his absolute predatory greed. He was standing on my soil, calling my people a blight, and declaring his family the great white saviors of the city. The reporters nodded enthusiastically, jotting down his every arrogant word. Then Preston took the microphone. He looked like the poster boy for unchecked privilege, wearing a tailored navy suit and a predatory smirk. "We are not just building real estate," Preston announced loudly to the crowd. "We are building a united legacy. As you know, my beautiful bride Maya comes from this very neighborhood. Her father, Vernon Jenkins, has been a fixture here for decades. But Mr. Jenkins recognized that his time has passed. He realized that this community needed resources and a level of business acumen that he simply could not provide." Preston scanned the crowd until his icy blue eyes found me standing near the back of the white canopy. His smirk widened into a look of absolute triumphant malice. "And today," Preston continued, pointing directly at me, "we are thrilled to announce that Mr. Jenkins has generously transferred the entirety of his commercial deeds to the Vance Group. Thanks to his monumental contribution, we will begin leveling these old blocks by the end of the month to make way for the future. Vernon, please come up here. Join your new family on stage. Let the city see the man who surrendered the past so we could build the future." The crowd of reporters and politicians parted immediately, creating a narrow aisle for me to walk through. I shuffled forward very slowly. I dragged my worn shoes against the pavement, letting my hands tremble visibly at my sides. I could hear the hushed, pitying murmurs from the journalists as I passed them. They looked at me with deep sorrow. They saw a foolish, uneducated minority who had just been legally robbed of his life savings by a slick corporate machine. I climbed the short steps to the stage, keeping my eyes fixed firmly on the wooden floorboards. When I reached the podium, Preston stepped over and wrapped his arm heavily around my shoulder. His grip was painfully tight, his fingers digging deliberately into my collarbone. He was treating me like a tamed, obedient pet. He patted my shoulder twice, a highly condescending gesture meant to establish total dominance in front of the television cameras. "This is a man who knows when to step aside," Preston said into the microphone, his voice dripping with fake admiration and hidden mockery. He knew he was entirely out of his depth, and he trusted the Vance family to take the reins and fix his mistakes. Preston turned toward me. He held the microphone out, shoving it aggressively toward my face. "Vernon," he whispered softly, his tone threatening and cold so the microphones would not pick it up. "Go ahead. Say a few words of gratitude. Thank us for taking this worthless neighborhood off your hands. Thank us for saving your daughter from a life of pathetic poverty. Do not mess this up, old man." I reached out with a shaking hand and took the cold metal microphone from his grip. The entire plaza fell completely silent. The cameras stopped flashing. The reporters held their breath, waiting for the broken father to publicly surrender his dignity on live television. Maya looked up at me from the front row. Her face was incredibly pale and fresh tears were pooling in her beautiful eyes. She thought I had given up everything I owned just to be allowed near her again. Richard and Margaret Vance stood right behind me, their chests puffed out in arrogant, untouchable victory. Preston kept his heavy, patronizing hand resting on my shoulder, absolutely certain that he owned me. I stood there in the silence for 5 long seconds. I let the arrogant silence stretch until it became incredibly heavy and profoundly uncomfortable. And then everything changed. I took a slow, deliberate breath of the humid Atlanta air. I straightened my spine, rising up to my full, intimidating height. I rolled my broad shoulders backward, and with one swift, effortless motion, I shrugged Preston's hand off my shoulder like I was brushing away a dead insect. The fake, pathetic tremor in my fingers vanished entirely. My grip on the microphone became rock solid. I lifted my head slowly and looked directly into the glowing red lenses of the television cameras. The frail, terrified old man simply evaporated into the morning heat. My eyes, which had been cast down in submission for the last 48 hours, shifted completely. They turned into the cold, dead, unblinking stare of an apex predator who had finally locked the cage doors from the inside. I stood at the podium and felt the heavy silence of the plaza wash over me. The humid Atlanta morning air was thick and suffocating, but my mind was completely clear. I gripped the cold metal of the microphone. The reporters in the front row lowered their notepads. The look of pity in their eyes vanished instantly, replaced by an electric buzzing confusion. The frail, trembling mechanic they had been writing their tragic stories about was gone. In his place stood a man who had built invisible empires. I looked out over the sea of cameras, making sure every single red recording light was fixed squarely on my face. "My son-in-law is absolutely right," I began. My voice did not shake. It did not waver. It resonated through the massive outdoor speakers with a deep, booming authority that made several city council members physically flinch in their front row seats. Yesterday, at his beautiful wedding, surrounded by his wealthy friends and his powerful family, I did exactly what he asked me to do. I took his gold-plated pen and I signed a legal transfer document. Preston puffed out his chest and a smug, arrogant smile briefly returned to his face. He looked at the reporters and nodded, playing the role of the benevolent savior. He truly believed I was playing along with his script. He thought I was surrendering on live television. But there is a fundamental problem with people like the Vance family. I continued, my voice echoing off the historic brick facades of my neighborhood. They are entirely blinded by their own privilege. They look at a 72-year-old black man with calloused hands and a faded suit, and they see a convenient victim. They assume I am uneducated. They assume I am desperate. And because of that monumental, unforgivable arrogance, they never bother to do their basic due diligence. A wave of nervous whispers rippled through the crowd of journalists. The local politicians shifted uncomfortably in their seats, realizing that the narrative was suddenly violently shifting. I turned my head slowly and looked Preston dead in the eye. The smug smile on his face began to waver, replaced by a sudden sickening flicker of doubt. The color started to drain from his cheeks. "You see," I said, my tone dropping to a cold, lethal register, "Preston was so incredibly eager to steal my legacy that he never bothered to check the actual county registry. He assumed that because I collected the rent and swept the sidewalks, the deeds were registered in my personal name. But if you had hired a competent corporate lawyer instead of relying on your own inflated ego, you would have discovered a very interesting fact." Preston took a step back, his breathing suddenly shallow. Behind him, Margaret and Richard Vance froze, their perfect posture crumbling as sheer panic began to set in. "The 6 commercial properties you plan to bulldoze do not belong to me," I announced, looking back at the television cameras. "They have not belonged to me for a very long time. 3 years ago, I transferred the absolute irrevocable ownership of this entire commercial district into a federally protected Black Heritage Preservation Trust. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of a multi-million-dollar house of cards collapsing in real time. I let the reality of those words settle over the plaza. I looked down at the front row where Maya was sitting. Her tear-filled eyes were wide with shock, but the terror was slowly being replaced by awe. She was watching her father, the man she thought was broken, rise up and defend their community like a titan. "That means this land is classified as historic." I continued, driving the final nail into their coffin. "It can never be sold to private developers. It can never be bulldozed. It will belong to the people of the West End forever. And it absolutely cannot be used as collateral to save your failing company. The paper you forced me to sign at your wedding, the document you are planning to take to the bank this afternoon to save yourselves from total bankruptcy, is nothing but a worthless scrap of paper. You had me sign it using the name of a shell company that I legally dissolved 30 days ago. You do not own the West End, Preston. You do not own a single solitary brick of the ground you are standing on." Total chaos erupted in the plaza. The journalists began shouting questions all at once, the camera flashes going off like strobe lights. Preston staggered backward as if he had been physically struck in the chest. His pristine navy suit suddenly looked like a straitjacket. He looked at his hands and then looked frantically at his parents. He knew they were ruined. He knew the shadow lenders were waiting for their $15 million by noon, and he had absolutely nothing to give them. Richard Vance lost his mind completely. The polished corporate facade melted away, revealing the desperate cornered animal underneath. He realized that his entire empire, his mansion, his cars, his legacy were about to be seized by the criminal underworld. With a roar of pure rage, he lunged forward. He rushed across the stage, his face red and contorted, charging directly at me to snatch the microphone from my hands and silence the broadcast. But I was not the fragile old man he thought I was. 40 years of lifting engine blocks and hauling steel had given me a foundation of pure iron. As Richard aggressively reached for the microphone, I simply shifted my weight, planted my feet, and brought my left arm up. I struck his forearm with a rigid, bone-crushing block. The impact made a loud, dull thud over the speakers. Richard cried out in pain, his arm recoiling violently. He stumbled backward, gripping his wrist, looking at me with absolute terror. He had hit a brick wall. "Do not ever touch me again," I growled, my voice dropping so low it vibrated through the floorboards of the stage. Margaret Vance ran up the steps, her expensive heels clicking frantically against the wood. She grabbed her husband, pulling him back while pointing a trembling, manicured finger right at my face. "You old fraud!" she screamed, her voice shrill and hysterical, completely losing her country club elegance. "You lied to us. We will sue you into the ground. We will take you to federal court. The Vance Group will crush you. We will destroy your entire life." I looked at the three of them trembling, sweating, and screaming on the stage they had built to humiliate me. They were threatening me with the Vance Group. They were threatening me with a company that was currently bleeding to death on my operating table. "You cannot sue me, Margaret," I said, perfectly calm amidst the flashing cameras and the screaming crowd. "And the Vance Group is not going to crush anyone." I reached inside the breast pocket of my faded charcoal suit. My fingers wrapped around a thick folded stack of legal papers. Desmond had delivered them to my house at dawn. They were heavy with the weight of absolute destruction. I slowly pulled the documents out into the morning sunlight. The bright red official acquisition stamps glared against the crisp white paper for everyone to see. I held the documents up, looking directly at Richard Vance, whose face had just turned the color of ash. I had just taken away their stolen property. Now it was time to take away their freedom. Margaret Vance was still pointing her trembling, manicured finger at my face, screaming that the Vance Group would crush me into dust. I looked at her shaking hand, and then I looked down at the heavy stack of legal documents I had just pulled from my breast pocket. The bright red acquisition stamps from my legal team practically glowed in the humid morning sun. I stepped away from the microphone for a brief second and walked directly over to the press conference table where their pristine branded water bottles and glossy promotional brochures were arranged perfectly. I lifted the thick stack of papers and slammed them down onto the table with a loud, resounding smack that echoed across the plaza. "The Vance Group," I repeated, stepping back to the microphone so my deep voice would project over the massive outdoor speakers. "Is that the exact same Vance Group that is currently suffocating under a $15 million mountain of toxic high-interest debt? Is that the same glorious real estate empire that took out illegal backdoor loans from shadow banks because every legitimate financial institution in the state of Georgia realized you were running a pathetic house of cards?" The color drained from Richard Vance's face so fast he looked like a walking corpse. Margaret's mouth snapped shut instantly, her arm dropping weakly to her side as if the invisible strings holding her up had just been violently severed. They thought their financial ruin was a closely guarded secret. They thought no one in the polite corporate world knew about their desperate dealings with the criminal underworld. The reporters in the front row erupted into a chaotic frenzy, shouting over each other, desperately trying to get a camera shot of the documents sitting on the table. I did not let the noise drown me out. I leaned into the microphone, my voice slicing through the chaos like a cold steel blade. "It is a very funny coincidence, Richard," I continued, my eyes locked firmly onto his terrified, sweating face. "You see those dangerous men you borrowed that money from, the ones demanding full repayment by noon today? They are not very patient people, but they are businessmen. And when an investment fund called Onyx Capital approached them late last night and offered to buy your entire debt portfolio for a massive premium in cold hard cash, they were more than happy to sell your miserable souls to the highest bidder." Preston's legs literally gave out. He stumbled backward, catching himself clumsily on the edge of a display banner. His perfectly styled blonde hair fell across his forehead. He knew exactly what Onyx Capital was. Every greedy developer in the city knew the name of the ruthless, anonymous private equity firm that controlled hundreds of millions of dollars in commercial real estate across the South. What he did not know, what his arrogant, racist mind could never have possibly comprehended, was that the old black mechanic he had been mocking for the last 48 hours was the sole majority shareholder of that exact fund. "I am Onyx Capital," I declared, letting the absolute heavy weight of those 4 words crush whatever pathetic hope they had left in their bodies. "I am the sole owner of your entire $15 million debt. I own the mortgage on your towering glass corporate headquarters downtown. I own the aggressive liens on your imported luxury vehicles. I own the deed to your sprawling multi-million-dollar estate in Buckhead. As of 8 o'clock this morning, the mighty Vance family does not own a single solitary asset to their name. You work for me now." The camera shutters were firing like machine guns. The local politicians and city council members who had been standing so proudly behind the Vance family just moments ago were now practically sprinting off the stage, desperately trying to distance themselves from the radioactive corporate fallout. Richard Vance clutched his chest, his breathing rapid and shallow, looking like he was about to have a massive heart attack right there on the wooden floorboards. Margaret was hyperventilating, staring at the legal documents on the table as if they were a ticking bomb ready to end her country club existence. But I was not finished. The silence of the devil demands absolute total destruction. I had promised my late wife I would burn their legacy to the ground, and I meant every single word. And because I am your primary legal creditor, I announced to the plaza, my voice booming with unwavering authority, I get to enforce the terms of your loans. Standard contracts dictate a 30-day grace period for any financial defaults. However, thanks to the incredibly stupid and highly illegal stunt you pulled at the wedding yesterday, I am officially invoking the immediate acceleration clause. Preston looked up, his eyes wide with wild, unadulterated panic. He had studied corporate finance. He knew exactly what an acceleration clause meant. Attempting to force me to sign away my real estate assets using a fraudulent contract constitutes a deliberate, malicious act of financial fraud, I explained methodically, making sure every single journalist recorded the details. Under the strict terms of your shadow loans, any suspected fraudulent activity grants the creditor the absolute right to demand immediate and total repayment. You have exactly 0 seconds to pay me $15 million, which means as of this exact moment I am foreclosing on your entire empire. My legal team is already at the courthouse filing the seizure documents. My private security teams are currently locking the heavy glass doors of your corporate headquarters. Your bank accounts are entirely frozen. You are completely legally and officially bankrupt. The reality of the situation hit Preston like a runaway freight train. He looked at his father, who was leaning heavily against a folding chair, completely defeated and broken. He looked at his mother, who was sobbing uncontrollably into her hands, ruining her expensive makeup. The golden boy of Atlanta real estate had just been stripped naked in front of the entire city. He had lost his money, his company, his home, and his completely unearned pride in a matter of 5 minutes. But predators like Preston Vance do not just accept defeat gracefully. When they are cornered, when all their money and power is stripped away, they instinctively lash out at the only thing they think they can still control. Preston spun around. His icy blue eyes were completely bloodshot, filled with a crazed, violent desperation. He looked down at the front row where Maya was sitting. My beautiful daughter was frozen in her seat, staring at the stage in absolute shock. She was slowly processing the horrific fact that the wealthy family she married into was nothing but a mirage of lies, debt, and manipulation. Preston leaped off the edge of the stage, his pristine navy suit jacket flying open. He lunged directly at Maya like a feral animal. Before I could even step off the podium, he reached out and grabbed her arm with a violent, terrifying force. He yanked her up from her folding chair, his fingers digging brutally deep into her bare skin. Maya cried out in sudden pain, trying desperately to pull away, but he tightened his cruel grip, shaking her roughly. "Tell your father to stop right now," Preston roared, his voice echoing across the plaza, completely stripped of any polite corporate charm. "Tell him to cancel the foreclosure right now. You are my wife. You belong to me. If you do not fix this right this second, I swear to God your life with me will be absolute hell. I will make you pay for every single thing he is doing to my family." Maya recoiled in sheer physical terror, shrinking away from the man she had loved for 10 years. The polished mask had completely slipped and shattered on the concrete. In front of dozens of rolling cameras, reporters, and city officials, the polished white knight had instantly transformed into a raging, abusive monster. A collective horrified gasp echoed through the large crowd. 2 private security guards standing near the edge of the stage started to move forward to intervene, but I raised my hand high into the air, stopping them dead in their tracks. I did not need security. I did not need the police yet. I stepped down from the wooden podium, my eyes locked entirely onto Preston Vance. The time for corporate business was over. He had just laid his violent hands on my little girl. It was time to play the final, ultimate card. I stepped down from the wooden podium and walked directly toward Preston. The crowd of reporters parted like the Red Sea, allowing me a clear path to the man who was currently holding my daughter hostage in front of the entire city. I did not rush my steps. I did not sprint. A man who holds all the power never needs to run. Preston was still gripping Maya by the upper arm. His knuckles were bone white. He was breathing heavily like a trapped and cornered animal. He thought physical intimidation would work on me. He thought the desperate threat of hurting my daughter would make me back down, fold my cards, and cancel the financial foreclosure on his family empire. He was completely wrong. I stopped exactly 2 feet away from him. I looked down at his hand gripping my daughter's skin, and then I looked directly into his panicked blue eyes. I spoke in a voice so quiet and so cold that the journalists in the front row actually leaned forward to hear it over the ambient noise of the city. I told him to let her go right this second. Preston laughed, a desperate, ugly sound that carried no real confidence. He told me I had no right to order him around. He said Maya was his wife and she would do whatever he commanded. He told me to pick up my phone, call my lawyers, and reverse the debt acquisition, or he would make sure she paid the price for my arrogance. I did not reach for my phone. I reached into my inner suit jacket pocket and pulled out the thick red leather notebook. I held it up high in the humid morning air so every single camera lens in the plaza could focus on it. Preston's eyes widened in sheer horror. The arrogant sneer completely melted off his face, replaced by a mask of absolute terror. He recognized the red leather immediately. It was his personal ledger, the one he thought was safely hidden away in his private dressing room at the hotel under piles of discarded trash. I turned my attention away from him and looked at my daughter. Maya was trembling violently, still trying to pull her arm away from his vice-like grip. I told her to listen to me very carefully. I told her that for 10 long years I never stopped looking for her for a single day. I told her I wrote her a letter every single week, hoping she would read them. I told her I hired private investigators who always hit mysterious dead ends and walls of silence. I watched the sheer confusion wash over her beautiful face. She shook her head, sobbing, and told me she never got any letters. She said she thought I hated her for leaving. I pointed a finger directly at Preston's face. I told the entire plaza and the thousands of people who would watch the evening news that the man holding her arm was not a romantic savior. He was a psychological warden. I explained to the flashing cameras that this red notebook contained a detailed handwritten log of a decade of mental torture and calculated isolation. I read the specific entries out loud from memory. I told the crowd how Preston had hired people to hack her email accounts to alienate her from her college friends. I told them how he bribed her former landlords with thousands of dollars in cash to throw away my letters before she could ever see the envelopes. I told them how he studied my handwriting and forged cruel rejection notes, making her believe her own father despised the ground she walked on. I told them about the staged mugging he paid for just so he could swoop in and play the hero. Maya stopped struggling. Her entire body went completely rigid as the truth washed over her like a bucket of ice water. She turned her head slowly and looked at the man she had just married. Her eyes were wide with a horrifying, profound realization. She asked him if it was true. She asked him in a broken whisper if he had intercepted the letters from her father. Preston stammered uncontrollably. He tried desperately to deny it. He said I was a liar, a manipulator, and an angry old man trying to ruin their happiness. He tightened his grip on her arm, pulling her closer, telling her not to listen to a crazy old man who just wanted to tear them apart. But I was not finished tearing down his world. Words can be denied and twisted, but concrete visual evidence cannot be argued with. I looked over the chaotic crowd toward the massive production tent set up by the Vance family event planners. Standing right next to the complex audio-visual control board was young Kobe, the brave chef from the hotel. He had followed my instructions perfectly. He had slipped out of the hotel and brought the notebook to me, and now he was here to finish the job. I caught his eye and gave him a single sharp nod. Kobe pressed a master switch on the control board. The massive LED screen behind the stage, the one that had been proudly displaying the shiny Vance Group corporate logo all morning, suddenly went completely black. A second later, a shaky, vertical cell phone video filled the massive screen towering over the entire plaza. Kobe had left his phone recording on a high shelf in the bridal suite while he was clearing plates the night before. The audio boomed over the high-definition plaza speakers, making everyone jump. It was Preston in the bridal suite right after the wedding reception. He had taken off his white tuxedo jacket and had backed Maya into a dark corner of the room. The entire press conference watched in absolute stunned silence as the real Preston Vance was broadcast to the world. On the giant screen, Preston pointed a threatening finger directly in Maya's face. His voice was dripping with pure toxic hatred. He told her to stop crying and to wipe the pathetic look off her face immediately. He told her that she was nothing without him and his money. He said she was just a piece of street trash he picked up for the sole purpose of securing his family legacy. He laughed directly in her face, a cruel echoing sound boasting about how incredibly easy it was to trick her stupid father into signing away the West End commercial district. He told her that once the bank loan was officially secured on Monday morning, she would be locked away in their suburban house with no money, no phone, and no way to ever contact her family or friends again. He called her a naive, uneducated pawn in a rich man game. He pushed her roughly against the wall, telling her she belonged to him body and soul, and that she would do exactly what he said for the rest of her miserable life. The video played for 2 agonizing, brutal minutes. Every single local politician, every wealthy corporate investor, and every journalist in the plaza watched the true face of the golden boy of Atlanta real estate. They watched him abuse, degrade, and violently threaten a vulnerable black woman behind closed doors. The polished, progressive white knight facade did not just crack. It completely shattered into a million unfixable pieces. The collective gasp from the crowd sounded like all the oxygen had been sucked out of the plaza. Preston stood frozen in the middle of the crowd. He let go of Maya's arm as if her skin had suddenly caught fire. He looked around wildly at the flashing cameras and the disgusted faces of his peers, realizing that his entire life was completely, permanently over. There was no expensive public relations firm in the world that could spin this level of documented abuse. He was ruined financially, socially, and legally in the span of 10 minutes. Maya stumbled backward away from him. Her hands covered her mouth, and a gut-wrenching, agonizing sob tore from her throat. The man she had loved, the man she thought had rescued her from a cold and lonely world, had actually been her greatest tormentor. He had engineered her misery from the very beginning. He had built the cage she lived in and managed to convince her it was a beautiful castle. She looked at him with absolute, unadulterated revulsion, backing away until she bumped into my chest. I did not hesitate for a second. I wrapped my strong arms tightly around my daughter. She turned and collapsed against me, crying harder than she had when she was a little girl. I held her securely, burying my face in her hair, feeling the tremendous weight of a 10-year absence finally washing away. I told her she was safe now, and that he could never touch her again. I promised her that no one would ever control her life as long as I had breath in my lungs. She clung to my faded charcoal suit, crying and apologizing over and over again for believing his terrible lies. Preston was hyperventilating, stumbling blindly away from us. The reporters swarmed him instantly, shoving microphones in his face, shouting aggressive questions about the psychological abuse, the financial fraud, and the manipulation. Margaret Vance had collapsed onto the wooden stage, sobbing hysterically as the cameras captured every humiliating second of her downfall. Richard Vance was leaning over a table, clutching his chest, unable to breathe properly as the reality of their total destruction set in. I held my beautiful daughter in my arms and glared at the broken monsters surrounded by the hungry media. They had tried to take my land to save their failing company. They had tried to strip away my pride and treat me like an ignorant fool. But most unforgivably, they had tried to steal my child and lock her in a psychological prison. And for that exact reason, I had made sure the entire city witnessed their absolute, total, and irreversible destruction. The plaza was already descending into absolute madness. Reporters were shouting frantically into their microphones, camera lenses were practically shoved into the faces of the Vance family, and my daughter was crying safely against my chest. The video of Preston verbally abusing and threatening Maya had just played on the massive LED screen for the entire city to witness. The polished facade of their progressive real estate empire was shattered into a million unfixable pieces. But the true finale to this grand performance had not even arrived yet. I had promised my daughter and myself that I would not just bruise these monsters. I was going to dismantle their lives completely. A sharp, piercing wail of sirens suddenly cut through the humid morning air. From the main avenue, 3 unmarked black SUVs and 2 local police cruisers tore through the barricades. Their red and blue lights flashed wildly against the glaringly white canopy the Vance family had erected to celebrate their hostile takeover. The crowd of journalists and city officials parted instantly, murmuring in a new wave of shock and confusion. The heavy doors of the lead SUV flew open. My attorney Desmond stepped out into the Atlanta heat. He adjusted his perfectly tailored suit, looking like the absolute executioner of the corporate world. Right behind him were 6 stern-looking individuals wearing dark windbreakers with Federal Financial Crimes Division printed in bold yellow letters across their backs. They moved with military precision, marching directly toward the wooden stage where the Vance family was helplessly trapped. Richard Vance scrambled backward, knocking over a row of expensive folding chairs. Margaret let out a piercing shriek as 2 federal agents immediately flanked her. The lead investigator, a tall, imposing woman with no time for wealthy entitlement, stepped up to the podium. She held up a thick stack of official warrants. Richard Vance, Margaret Vance, and Preston Vance, she announced, her voice carrying over the dead silence of the plaza. You are all under arrest. The charges include massive wire fraud conspiracy to commit bank fraud, illegal solicitation of funds from unregulated shadow entities, and a coordinated federal conspiracy to defraud a senior citizen of major real estate assets. Richard tried to run. The great corporate titan, the man who wanted to bulldoze my neighborhood to build high-rises for the elite, actually tried to push his way past a female reporter to escape down the side stairs of the stage. He did not make it 3 steps. A federal agent grabbed him by the expensive shoulder of his imported suit, spun him around, and slammed him face first onto the wooden floorboards. The loud metallic click of handcuffs echoing through the nearby microphone stand was the most beautiful music I had heard in 10 long years. Margaret Vance had completely lost whatever was left of her country club sanity. As an officer wrenched her hands behind her back to secure the steel cuffs, she thrashed wildly like a feral animal. Her expensive designer dress tore at the shoulder and her perfectly styled hair became a rat nest of sheer panic. She locked her furious, bloodshot eyes on me. "You filthy old black man," she screamed, her voice tearing her throat raw. The venom and deep-rooted racism she had hidden behind polite corporate smiles were finally spilling out into the open for all the cameras to capture. "You dare do this to us. You dare destroy my family. You destroyed our legacy. We are the Vances. You are nothing but a grease monkey from the slums." I kept my arm securely around my daughter, making sure she was shielded from the flailing, hysterical woman. I slowly stepped forward until I was standing right above Margaret, looking down at her as the federal agents forced her to her knees. I looked at her with absolutely no anger left in my soul. There was only the cold, hard reality of consequence. "I did not destroy your family, Margaret," I said, keeping my voice steady, deep, and perfectly calm. "I did not force you to take out $15 million in illegal loans from the criminal underworld. I did not force you to forge a contract to steal my land. I did not force your son to mentally torture my daughter for 10 years. Your own insatiable greed destroyed you. You built a massive house out of garbage and it finally collapsed on your own head. I am not the one who ruined you. I am just the garbage collector making sure the street gets cleaned up." The reporters captured every single word. Margaret sobbed hysterically, her face buried in her chest as the officers dragged her away toward the waiting SUVs. Richard was already being shoved into the back of a police cruiser, his head bowed in ultimate humiliating defeat. They had arrived at this plaza as conquering royalty, and they were leaving as common criminals. But there was still one predator left on the stage, Preston Vance. He was backing away slowly, his hands raised in the air, his chest heaving with panicked, ragged breaths. His pristine white tuxedo shirt was soaked in sweat. The golden boy of Atlanta real estate realized that he had no money, no lawyers, and absolutely no way out. 2 federal agents moved in on him, but before they could grab his arms, Preston did the one thing I never expected a man of his arrogant privilege to do. He dropped to his knees. Right there in the middle of the historic West End Plaza, surrounded by flashing cameras and the minority community he had called a blight. Preston fell to his knees in front of an old black mechanic. He crawled forward on the wooden stage, completely ignoring the federal agents standing right behind him. "Vernon, please," he begged, his voice cracking, tears streaming down his flushed face. "Please, Mr. Jenkins, I can fix this. I can make it right. Just tell them to stop. Do not let them take me away. I have never been to prison. I will not survive in there. I will give you anything you want." I did not respond. I just stared down at the pathetic weeping boy who had spent 10 years playing God with my daughter mind. He thought he was untouchable, and now he was begging for his life in the dirt. When he realized I was not going to save him, Preston shifted his desperate eyes to Maya. He reached out with trembling hands, trying to grab the hem of her heavy antique white dress. "Maya, baby, please," he cried, a pathetic, gut-wrenching sound. "I know what that video showed, but you have to believe me. I was just stressed. I was just under so much pressure from the company. I did not mean those things. But I love you. I really, truly love you, Maya. You are my wife. Tell your father to give me one more chance. Please, Maya, save me." The entire plaza held its breath. The cameras focused tightly on my daughter. Maya looked down at the man who had isolated her, manipulated her, and broken her spirit for a decade. She looked at the man who had intercepted my letters and convinced her that she was completely unloved. She took a deep, shaky breath, and for the first time in 10 years she stepped completely out from behind his shadow. She did not yell, she did not cry, she just looked at him with absolute, unbreakable disgust. She took one definitive step backward, pulling her dress out of his reach, and placed herself firmly by my side. She linked her arm through mine, choosing her real family over her abuser. Preston let out a loud wail of absolute despair, realizing that his final manipulation had completely failed. I looked at the federal agents standing right behind him and gave them a single subtle nod. I turned my back to Preston Vance. I wrapped my arm tightly around my beautiful daughter and we walked away together. The sound of his pathetic screaming faded into the background, abruptly cut off by the cold, heavy steel of the handcuffs clicking shut around his wrists, locking him into a cage of his own making. I drove my battered 20-year-old pickup truck slowly down the familiar tree-lined streets of the West End. The heavy, humid Atlanta air blowing through the open windows felt different now. It felt clean. The passenger seat, which had been empty for 10 agonizing years, was finally occupied by my beautiful daughter. Maya sat quietly looking out the window at the brick storefronts and the old oak trees she had grown up around. She was still wearing that heavy antique white wedding dress. It looked completely absurd and wildly out of place against the cracked vinyl seating of my old truck, but I did not care. My little girl was coming home. I pulled into the narrow driveway of our modest brick house. I turned off the engine and the quiet hum of the neighborhood settled around us. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Maya stared at the front porch where her mother and I used to sit every Sunday evening. Her lower lip began to tremble. I got out of the truck, walked around to the passenger side, and opened her door. I offered her my calloused hand. She took it, her fingers gripping mine so tightly it felt like she was terrified I might disappear if she let go. I unlocked the front door and pushed it open. The house smelled exactly the same as it did a decade ago, a mixture of old pine wood, lemon furniture polish, and the faint lingering scent of the lavender soap Beatrice always used. The living room was perfectly preserved. The floral sofa, the faded oriental rug, and the mantel lined with silver-framed photographs were exactly where she had left them. Maya stepped inside tentatively. Her eyes wandered across the room, eventually landing on a large framed photograph of her mother sitting right in the center of the mantel. Next to it was a picture of Maya on her high school graduation day. I had dusted those frames every single morning for 10 years. The dam finally broke. Maya dropped to her knees right there on the woven living room rug. The heavy layers of the designer wedding dress collapsed around her like a deflated parachute. She buried her face in her hands and let out a sound of such profound, agonizing sorrow that it physically tore at my heart. It was the sound of a decade of stolen time, of manipulated grief, and of overwhelming, unbearable guilt finally bursting out of her chest. "Dad, I am so sorry," she sobbed, her whole body shaking violently. "I am so sorry I believed him. I hated you for 10 years. I thought you threw me away. I thought you did not care about me anymore. I let him convince me that I was garbage to you. How could I have been so stupid? How could I have ever believed that you would stop loving me?" I crossed the room and dropped down onto the floor right beside her. My old knees ached against the hard wood, but I did not care. I wrapped my large, heavy arms around her, pulling her small, trembling frame tightly against my chest. I rocked her slowly, just like I did when she used to scrape her knees on the sidewalk as a little girl. "You listen to me, Maya," I said, my voice thick with unshed tears. "You have absolutely nothing to apologize for. You were young and you were vulnerable. That monster studied you. He isolated you. He built a cage around your mind so slowly that you did not even realize the doors had been locked. He forged my handwriting. He paid people to lie to you. He engineered your pain so he could play the savior. None of this was your fault. Do you hear me? You are my daughter, and my love for you is absolute. It is unbreakable. It never wavered for a single second." She cried into my shoulder, soaking the fabric of my faded charcoal suit. We sat there on the floor for a long time, letting the poison of Preston Vance slowly drain out of her system. When her sobs finally subsided into quiet hiccups, I helped her stand up and guided her to the old floral sofa. I went to the kitchen and poured her a glass of cold water. She took a slow sip, her eyes scanning the modest kitchen, the scuffed linoleum floor, and the old refrigerator. Then she looked up at me, her expression shifting from overwhelming grief to a deep, profound confusion. "Dad," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Who are you?" I sat down in the armchair across from her, resting my hands on my knees. "I saw what you did at the plaza today," she continued, her eyes searching my face for answers. "You did not just stand up to the Vance family, you destroyed them. You completely erased a multi-million-dollar real estate empire in 5 minutes. You said you owned their debt. You said you were Onyx Capital. How is that even possible? You are a mechanic. You have lived in this small house your entire life. Mom clipped coupons. We shopped at discount stores. Why did you hide this from me?" I let out a long, heavy sigh. I knew this conversation was coming. I knew that pulling back the curtain on my hidden power would inevitably bring up difficult questions. "Maya," I began speaking slowly and deliberately. "When your mother and I started making real money 40 years ago, we made a conscious choice. You have to understand what it was like for a black man in the South to acquire significant wealth back then. If you were loud about it, if you bought flashy cars and moved into gated white neighborhoods, you painted a massive glowing target on your own back. You invited jealousy, You invited predators, and you invited the kind of systemic scrutiny that could tear your life apart. I leaned forward, looking deeply into her eyes. But it was not just about protecting the money. It was about protecting our community. If the city knew a single man was buying up all the commercial property in the West End, they would have found legal loopholes to seize it. Operating through anonymous shell companies allowed me to act as a silent guardian. I kept the rent low for black business owners. I stopped predatory developers from tearing down our history. I used the shadows to build an invisible shield around the people I cared about. Maya wiped a stray tear from her cheek, processing the magnitude of what I was saying. But why hide it from me, Dad? I was your daughter. Because we wanted to protect you from the very thing that ended up hurting you, I explained. My voice filled with a heavy, tragic irony. Your mother and I wanted you to grow up valuing hard work, humility, and education. We did not want you to grow up as a trust fund heiress. We knew that visible wealth attracts the worst kind of people. People who look at you and only see a dollar sign. We wanted you to be loved for your heart, your mind, and your spirit. We thought that by hiding the money, we were hiding you from the gold diggers and the corporate sociopaths. I shook my head, a bitter taste filling my mouth. But that was my greatest mistake. I thought keeping my wealth a secret would shield you. But the tragic irony is that it did the exact opposite. Maya frowned, confused. What do you mean? Preston Vance is a predator, I explained softly. But he is a cowardly predator. He targets people he perceives as weak and isolated. When he met you, he saw a young black woman estranged from her family living on a modest income. He thought you were easy prey. He thought he could mold you, control you, and dominate you without any interference. And when he found out about my commercial deeds, he thought I was just a tired, ignorant old mechanic who got lucky and bought some land in the 70s. He targeted us precisely because of my disguise. If I had been driving a Rolls-Royce and wearing expensive suits, he never would have dared to approach you. My attempt to protect you with simplicity is exactly what made that monster think we were an easy meal. Maya stared at me, the realization washing over her. He thought we were nothing, she whispered. He thought he could just step on us and take what he wanted. Yes, I said, my eyes hardening. And that arrogance, that racist, unchecked privilege was his ultimate undoing. He dug his own grave because he was too arrogant to look at the soil he was digging in. A quiet peace finally settled over the living room. The truth was completely out in the open. There were no more secrets between us. I watched Maya lean back against the sofa cushions, the heavy exhaustion of the day finally catching up to her. For the first time in 10 years, I saw the tension leave her shoulders. She was home. She was safe. The Vance family was locked in federal custody, their empire completely dismantled, and their reputation burned to ash. We had won. The nightmare was officially over. Or so I thought. I walked into the kitchen to put a kettle on the stove. I wanted to make Beatrice's favorite chamomile tea for Maya. The water had just started to boil when my cell phone vibrated violently against the kitchen counter. I glanced at the screen. It was Desmond, my attorney. I picked up the phone, expecting a routine update on the foreclosure filings. Yes, Desmond, I said, pouring hot water into 2 ceramic mugs. Is the paperwork finalized? Mr. Jenkins? Desmond said, his voice unusually tight and completely stripped of its usual calm professionalism. We have a massive, terrifying problem. You need to secure your house right this second. I froze the kettle hovering in my hand. What are you talking about, Desmond? I literally watched the federal agents put Richard and Preston in handcuffs 3 hours ago. They are in federal custody. Preston and Margaret are in custody. Desmond corrected, his breathing rapid. But Richard Vance is not. He had an emergency hearing an hour ago. He used an undisclosed offshore account that the feds had not frozen yet to post a massive cash bail. He is out on the streets, Mr. Jenkins. My blood ran completely cold. Why are you telling me to secure my house? He has no money left in the country. He has no power. Because desperate men with nothing left to lose are the most dangerous animals on the planet. Desmond urged, his voice rising in panic. Richard Vance knows his life is over. He knows he is going to federal prison for the rest of his life, and he blames you for absolutely everything. My contacts in the shadow banking sector just called me in a panic. Before his accounts were totally frozen, Richard wired $200,000 to the exact same criminal syndicate he owed money to. For what I demanded, a deep, instinctual dread clawing at my stomach. He hired their muscle, Mr. Jenkins. Desmond practically shouted over the phone. He hired an arson crew. He gave them the exact coordinates to your commercial properties and your home address. If he cannot own the West End, he wants to watch it burn to the ground. They are coming to your neighborhood tonight, Mr. Jenkins. They are coming with gasoline, and they are coming to kill you." I hung up the phone and placed it gently on the kitchen counter. The heavy silence of my modest brick house felt entirely different now. It was no longer a sanctuary of peace. It was a fortress about to be besieged. I looked across the room at my daughter Maya. She was holding the ceramic mug of hot water, her hands trembling slightly against the warm clay. She saw the profound shift in my posture and the sudden terrifying coldness in my eyes. I did not panic. I did not raise my voice. I simply walked over to her and placed my hand on her shoulder. I told her to take her tea, go straight into the master bedroom, lock the heavy oak door, and stay away from the windows. She asked me what was happening, her voice tight with renewed fear. I told her that the garbage had not been fully taken out yet and I needed to finish cleaning the street. She nodded slowly, trusting me completely for the first time in 10 years. I waited until I heard the heavy click of the bedroom lock before I made my move. Desmond had warned me that Richard Vance was coming with a crew of ruthless arsonists from the Shadow Syndicate. Any normal man would have dialed the police immediately, begging for sirens and flashing lights to save him in the dark. But I was not a normal man. Calling the police in the West End meant waiting 20 minutes for a patrol car to show up. A fire only needs 3 minutes to reduce decades of history to ashes. Furthermore, this was no longer a legal corporate dispute. Richard Vance had crossed the sacred boundary of my home. He wanted to kill me, and he wanted to burn down the legacy of my people. This required a completely different kind of justice. I walked over to the old rotary telephone mounted on the kitchen wall. I did not call the authorities. I called 3 numbers I knew by absolute heart. I called Marcus, who ran the auto body shop down the block. I called Isaiah, who owned the historic corner bakery. I called Big John, who managed the neighborhood barbershop where 3 generations of black men got their hair cut. I did not have to explain the situation in detail. I simply told them that a wealthy white developer from the north side had paid criminals to burn down our commercial district tonight, and that he was on his way right now. The men I called were not just business owners. They were the fathers, brothers, and sons of the West End. They were the very people I had secretly protected from bankruptcy and eviction for 30 years, using the anonymous power of Onyx Capital. They did not ask me if I was sure. They did not ask me if we should wait for the law. They just told me they were already on their way. I stepped out onto my front porch and breathed in the suffocating, humid Atlanta night air. I walked down the cracked sidewalk toward the main commercial strip, leaving the safety of my brick house behind. The streetlights flickered, casting long, jagged shadows across the pavement. I positioned myself in the deep darkness of an alleyway nestled right between the bookstore and the diner. I stood perfectly still, letting my eyes adjust to the pitch-black surroundings. Slowly, the shadows around me began to shift and multiply. I did not hear any car engines or loud footsteps. The people of my community knew how to move in silence. Marcus arrived holding a heavy steel wrench. Big John appeared from the opposite corner, flanked by 5 of his broad-shouldered nephews. Soon there were over 50 men and women standing in the dark alleyways, hiding behind brick corners and waiting on the rooftops of the commercial buildings. They stood in absolute terrifying silence. We were a human fortress woven directly into the concrete of the neighborhood. 10 minutes later, the chaotic screech of heavy tires broke the stillness of the night. 3 dark, unmarked vans skidded to a violent halt right in the middle of the main avenue. The sliding doors ripped open and a dozen heavy-set men spilled out onto the asphalt. They were the hired muscle from the shadow banking syndicate, dressed in dark tactical clothing. They moved with aggressive, trained efficiency, pulling heavy red metal jerry cans of gasoline and iron crowbars from the back of the vehicles. And stepping out of the lead van, looking completely unhinged and manic, was Richard Vance. He was no longer the polished, arrogant billionaire who had stood on the stage that morning. His custom-tailored suit jacket was gone. He wore a dark, wrinkled shirt, his face pale and sweating profusely under the dim glow of the streetlights. His eyes were wide with a crazed, desperate, violent fury. He pointed a shaking finger at the brick facades of my commercial buildings. He yelled into the empty avenue, commanding the thugs to douse the wooden doorways and the brick walls with fuel. He screamed that if he could not own the West End, he was going to burn it to the ground and piss on the ashes. I stepped out of the dark alleyway and walked directly into the center of the avenue. I stood completely alone under the flickering yellow light of a street lamp, facing a dozen armed criminals and a broken billionaire. Richard saw me and let out a manic, ugly laugh that echoed against the silent buildings. He pointed at me, his face twisted into a mask of pure hatred. He told the thugs that I was the man they needed to kill. He screamed that I was just a weak-old mechanic who had gotten lucky and that they should break my legs before they lit the match. The lead thug, a massive man with a thick, jagged scar across his jaw, stepped forward. He carried a sloshing red gas can in his left hand and a heavy iron crowbar in his right. He cracked his neck, looking at me like I was nothing more than an insect waiting to be crushed. He took 3 aggressive steps toward me, ready to follow Richard's cruel orders. But as the thug got closer, the yellow light of the street lamp illuminated my face. He stopped dead in his tracks. His heavy boots scraped against the asphalt, halting his momentum entirely. He looked at my calm posture, the absolute lack of fear in my eyes, and the cold, steady rhythm of my breathing. He narrowed his eyes, studying my face with sudden, intense recognition. Then he remembered what his criminal bosses had urgently communicated to all their street crews that very afternoon. They had been paid $18 million to sell a massive debt portfolio to a ruthless anonymous entity known as Onyx Capital. And the frantic whisper that had circulated through the deepest layers of the Atlanta underworld all evening was that the true face of Onyx Capital, the man who now legally owned their entire syndicate financial leash, was an old black mechanic from the West End named Vernon Jenkins. The massive thug realized he was standing face to face with the apex predator of the city. He realized that the man Richard Vance had paid him to kill was the exact same man who currently held the power to eradicate his entire criminal organization with a single phone call to the federal authorities. The heavy red metal gas can slipped from the thug hand. It hit the asphalt with a loud, hollow clang, spilling a dark puddle of gasoline into the street gutter. He took a slow, terrified step backward, lowering his iron crowbar to his side. Richard Vance screamed at him, demanding to know what he was doing. He commanded the crew to light the fire and finish the job he had paid them for. The lead thug did not even look at Richard. He kept his terrified eyes locked firmly on me. He took another step back, raised his hands in a gesture of total surrender, and told his men to fall back immediately. He said out loud that nobody in their right mind burns the property of Mr. Jenkins. In less than 30 seconds, the entire squad of hired muscle dropped their gas cans and their weapons. They scrambled back into the dark vans, slammed the sliding doors shut, and sped away into the night, desperate to escape my neighborhood before they made the biggest mistake of their lives. Richard Vance was left completely alone, standing in the middle of the avenue. The arrogant billionaire who had tried to bulldoze my community was now standing in a puddle of spilled gasoline, abandoned by his own hired guns, trembling uncontrollably in the humid night air. He looked around wildly, realizing that his money, his power, and his white privilege had absolutely no jurisdiction on my streets. Then the shadows of the alleyways began to shift. From every corner, every doorway, and every rooftop, 50 men and women of the West End stepped out into the dim light of the avenue. They did not yell. They did not raise their weapons. They just walked forward in absolute terrifying unison, forming a tight, inescapable circle around Richard Vance. The sheer, silent weight of their presence was suffocating. Richard fell to his knees on the hard asphalt. His breathing turned into rapid, ragged gasps of pure panic. He began to weep, his tears mixing with the sweat on his pale face. I walked slowly through the circle of my people, stepping over the spilled gasoline until I was standing right in front of him. I reached down and grabbed the collar of his expensive, wrinkled shirt. I lifted him slightly off the pavement, forcing him to look directly into my eyes. His teeth were chattering and his body was shaking like a fragile leaf in a hurricane. I leaned in very close to his face. The smell of his expensive cologne was completely masked by the sour stench of his profound terror. I opened my mouth and delivered a whisper that would echo inside his mind for the rest of his miserable life. You spent your whole life tearing down our homes to build your castles, Richard. I whispered, my voice colder than the grave. But tonight you are just a trespasser in my kingdom, and I am the only one who decides if you get to see the sunrise. I let go of his collar and let him drop back onto the unforgiving asphalt. He scrambled backward, his chest heaving, his eyes darting around at the wall of silent, strong black men and women who surrounded him. You like real estate so much, Richard? I asked, my voice cutting through the thick, humid air of the night. You love the idea of taking people homes, of throwing them out on the street to build your glorious monuments to greed. Well, let me show you how the real game is played. Tomorrow morning you are going to learn exactly what it feels like to be on the other side of the bulldozer. I turned my back on him and walked away, the crowd parting to let me through. We left him kneeling in the puddle of gasoline, a broken, powerless man, in the very neighborhood he had planned to destroy. A few hours later, the sun began to rise over the city of Atlanta. While the West End woke up to the smell of fresh coffee and the quiet hum of honest hard work, a very different scene was unfolding in the hyper-wealthy neighborhood of Buckhead. This was the fortress of the elite, a place of sprawling mansions, manicured emerald lawns, and massive iron gates. It was a place designed to keep people like me out. But on this particular Friday morning, I was not knocking on the door to ask for permission to enter. I possessed the keys to the entire kingdom. I drove my battered 20-year-old pickup truck right through the open wrought iron gates of the Vance family estate. Behind me was a long, intimidating procession. Desmond drove his sleek black sedan, and right behind him were 4 massive moving trucks and 3 county sheriff patrol cars. The flashing blue lights reflected off the pristine white marble pillars of the Vance mansion. We parked directly in the circular driveway, the heavy diesel engines of the trucks disrupting the quiet, privileged peace of the morning. Desmond stepped out of his car holding a thick stack of court orders signed by a federal judge just hours ago. The acceleration clause on their toxic debt had been officially executed. Every single asset registered to the Vance family name now legally belonged to Onyx Capital. And I was not going to give them a 30-day notice. I was not going to give them a week to pack their bags. They were going to experience the exact same ruthless, terrifying displacement they had inflicted on countless low-income families for decades. The sheriffs marched up the wide stone steps and pounded heavily on the massive custom oak doors. A few moments later, the door swung open. Richard Vance stood there looking like a hollow shell of a human being. He had managed to bail himself and his wife out of federal holding late last night using a hidden offshore account, hoping they could regroup and hide in their fortress. He stared at the sheriffs, his eyes wide with exhausted panic, and then his gaze shifted to me standing next to my old rusted truck. By order of the county court, the lead sheriff announced loudly, "This property and all its contents are hereby seized under immediate foreclosure. You and your family have exactly 10 minutes to vacate the premises. You are permitted to take only the clothes currently on your backs. Everything else belongs to the creditor." Margaret Vance appeared at the top of the grand marble staircase. She was wearing an expensive silk morning robe, her hair a chaotic mess from her night in a holding cell. When she heard the sheriff words, a guttural, horrifying scream ripped from her throat. It was not a scream of sadness. It was the absolute, unrestrained shriek of a spoiled, entitled woman watching her entire identity being ripped away from her. She ran down the stairs, practically tripping over her own feet, shouting that this was a mistake, that they were the Vance family, that they could not be thrown out of their own home like common criminals. She charged toward the front door, demanding that the officers arrest me for trespassing. The sheriffs did not even blink. They stepped inside the mansion and instructed the moving crews to begin the seizure. A dozen men in heavy work boots flooded into the pristine, immaculately decorated foyer. They did not care about the delicate imported rugs or the crystal vases. They began picking up the antique furniture, the expensive modern art pieces, and the pure silver decorations, hauling them straight out the front door and loading them into the back of the moving trucks. Margaret lost her mind completely. She grabbed the arm of a mover who was carrying a massive landscape painting, trying to wrestle it out of his hands. A female deputy immediately stepped in, grabbed Margaret firmly by the arms, and physically escorted her out of the front door and down the stone steps. Richard followed right behind them, stumbling like a ghost, completely incapable of defending his wife or his property. They were pushed all the way down the long driveway, past the fountain, and directly onto the public sidewalk just outside their massive iron gates. I walked down the driveway and stood on the other side of the gate looking at them. The morning sun was shining brightly now. Margaret was on her hands and knees on the hard concrete sidewalk, weeping hysterically as the moving crew began to carry out racks of her designer dresses and throw them unceremoniously into cardboard boxes on the lawn. Her precious life, built on the suffering of others, was being packed away into cheap brown boxes. She looked up at me through the iron bars of the gate. Her face was streaked with running makeup, her eyes completely bloodshot. She opened her mouth to scream another insult, but I cut her off before she could speak a single word. "You told my daughter that she did not belong in your hotel," I said, my voice echoing clearly in the quiet morning air. "You said that looking at a black woman wearing your family antique white dress made your eyes feel dirty. You said she was a street rat." I gestured to the concrete sidewalk she was kneeling on, surrounded by the discarded remnants of her fake stolen wealth. "Tell me something, Margaret." I continued, showing absolutely no mercy. "Does this look dirty to you? Does the pavement feel cold? You spent your entire life measuring your worth by the price tag on your clothes and the size of your mansion. You thought that money made you a superior human being. You thought you were untouchable. But look at you now. You are kneeling in the dirt with absolutely nothing. You do not even own the silk robe on your back. Richard tried to put his arm around his wife, but she shoved him away violently, screaming that this was all his fault, that his stupid business deals had ruined her life. Even in their darkest moment, they had no loyalty to each other. Their marriage, just like their empire, was nothing but a fragile transaction. The commotion had finally attracted the attention of the neighborhood. The heavy oak doors of the surrounding mansions began to open. Wealthy neighbors, the exact same people Margaret and Richard used to drink champagne with at the country club, stepped out onto their manicured lawns. They wore expensive morning clothes and held cups of gourmet coffee. Margaret saw them watching. She reached out her hand, calling out to a woman next door, begging her to call the governor, pleading for help. But the neighbors did not come to her aid. They did not cross the street to offer comfort. They just stood on their pristine lawns and watched in absolute silent disgust. In the world of the ultra-wealthy, there is no greater sin than going bankrupt. To them, the Vance family was no longer a powerful dynasty. They were a toxic liability. They were a contagious disease. The people Margaret had spent her entire life trying to impress were now looking at her with the exact same revulsion she had directed at my daughter just 24 hours ago. The ultimate punishment for a narcissist is not physical pain or even prison. It is total, irreversible social annihilation. Margaret Vance realized in that exact moment that she had not just lost her money. She had lost her status, her reputation, and her identity. She was a total outcast, stripped of everything that made her feel important. She collapsed onto the sidewalk, curling into a tight, miserable ball, wailing into the concrete as the moving trucks continued to swallow her entire existence. Richard stood over her, completely paralyzed, looking at the massive mansion he used to rule, realizing he would never step foot inside it again. I turned my back on them and walked toward my old rusted truck. I did not feel any joy or triumph. Destroying a family is not something to celebrate. But I felt a profound, heavy sense of peace. The scales of justice had finally been balanced. The predators had been completely disarmed. They had wanted to take everything from me, and in the end they were the ones left standing on the curb, shivering in the morning air with absolutely nowhere to go. I climbed into the driver's seat of my truck, started the roaring engine, and drove away from the gates, leaving the Vance family in the rearview mirror forever. The hunt was officially over, and it was time to go home to my daughter. The legal system is a fascinating machine. When you have unlimited wealth and the right connections, the wheels of justice turn incredibly slow. But when your accounts are completely frozen, your reputation is shattered, and you are facing the full, devastating weight of federal prosecutors, that machine moves with terrifying speed. Preston Vance learned that harsh lesson in record time. The divorce between my daughter and the man who had mentally tortured her for a decade was the easiest and fastest legal proceeding my attorney Desmond had ever facilitated. Preston did not fight the divorce. He had absolutely no resources left to fight with. He was sitting in a maximum security federal holding facility facing a minimum of 20 years in prison for massive wire fraud, felony forgery, and a coordinated conspiracy to defraud a senior citizen. The untouchable golden boy of Atlanta real estate had been completely erased from the map. When Maya walked into that sterile, cold concrete visitation room to slide the divorce papers across the metal table, she did not look like the terrified, exhausted girl from the wedding plaza. She wore a sharp, dark, tailored business suit. Her spine was perfectly straight. Her head was held high. Preston reached for the pen with trembling, pale hands. He was wearing a standard-issue bright orange jumpsuit that swallowed his previously immaculate posture. He looked up at her, his eyes hollow red and pathetic. He tried to speak. He tried to beg for a sliver of sympathy, blaming his parents, blaming the pressure of the business, blaming everything but his own wicked soul. Maya did not give him a single drop of mercy. She did not raise her voice. She simply looked at him with the cold, detached indifference you would give a piece of trash on the sidewalk. She told him that his wealth was always a mirage, but his soul was truly bankrupt. She watched him sign the papers, took the folder, turned her back, and walked out of that prison without looking over her shoulder a single time. The heavy steel doors slammed shut behind her, locking the ghost of her abuser away in a cage where he belonged. Back in the West End, the air felt remarkably different. It felt clean, vibrant, and alive. The looming threat of the Vance family bulldozers had been completely eradicated. Instead of tearing down our rich history, we were finally building it up. Using the anonymous power of Onyx Capital, Y started funneling millions of dollars of clean, legitimate investments directly into the neighborhood. We were not building soulless luxury high-rises to push our people out. We were renovating the historic brick facades. We were upgrading the plumbing and the electrical systems for the local bakeries, the barbershops, and the family-owned bookstores. We were ensuring that the people who built the community with their own sweat could actually afford to stay in it and thrive. We were building an economic fortress that no greedy, predatory developer could ever breach again. A few weeks after the dust settled, I made a very important phone call. I asked young Kobe, the brave chef from the hotel pantry who had risked his entire livelihood, to warn me to meet me at a corner lot on the main avenue. The building had been vacant for 2 years, but my construction crews had spent the last month completely gutting and rebuilding the interior. When Kobe arrived, he looked nervous. He was still wearing his old, worn-out sneakers and a faded graphic t-shirt. He probably thought I was calling him to ask for another favor, or maybe to testify in court. I greeted him warmly and walked him through the newly installed glass doors. The inside was magnificent. It featured a brand new state-of-the-art commercial kitchen connected to a beautiful open dining room with warm, exposed brick walls and polished wooden tables. Kobe looked around in absolute awe. He ran his hand gently over the pristine stainless steel countertops. He asked me what wealthy restaurant group was moving in. I reached into my pocket, pulled out a heavy set of brass keys, and placed them directly into the palm of his hand. I told him he was moving in. I explained to the young man that courage and loyalty are the rarest currencies in this world, and he had paid his dues in full. I did not just give him a job as a head chef. I handed him the deed to the building. I told him he was the sole owner of the newest soul food restaurant in the West End. Kobe broke down in tears right there in the middle of the empty dining room. He hugged me tightly, thanking me profusely, saying he could finally take care of his mother and his little sister without constantly worrying about eviction. I smiled and told him that was exactly what men like us are supposed to do. We protect our own and we lift each other up. But the greatest and most beautiful transformation of all did not happen to the neighborhood streets. It happened right inside my own home. Healing from 10 years of intense psychological isolation does not happen overnight. There were hard days. There were nights when Maya woke up crying from terrible nightmares, terrified that the dark life she had escaped would somehow pull her back in. But she did not break. She used the immense pain as fuel. She refused to be a victim for a single second longer. I decided it was time to pull the curtain back completely. I brought Maya into the highly secure, heavily guarded downtown offices of Onyx Capital. I introduced her to Desmond and the rest of our executive board. I showed her the massive financial portfolios, the complex investment strategies, and the sheer, overwhelming financial firepower we quietly commanded. I told her that this empire was not built just to make me a rich man. It was built to be a heavy shield for the vulnerable and a sharp sword against monsters like the Vance family. And now it was her turn to learn exactly how to wield it. Maya threw herself into the business with a ferocious, breathtaking intensity. She was naturally brilliant, possessing a mind that absorbed information like a sponge. She devoured complex financial reports, studied corporate property law, and learned how to identify predatory lending schemes from a mile away. She began sitting in on high-level negotiations with a cold, analytical focus that made veteran bankers and arrogant investors sweat nervously in their custom suits. She was no longer the naive, isolated young woman who could be manipulated by a charming smile and a fake promise. She was rapidly becoming a formidable, untouchable black woman. She learned how to use silence as an intimidation tactic, just like her father always had. She learned that true power does not need to raise its voice to control a room. One afternoon, I stood quietly in the doorway of our main conference room and just watched her. She was sitting at the head of the massive mahogany table, carefully reviewing a contract for a new community housing initiative that would protect dozens of minority families from gentrification. She wore a dark, elegant business suit. Her posture was flawless, radiating an aura of absolute authority. A team of highly paid corporate lawyers sat around her, waiting nervously for her approval. She read the final page, picked up her pen, and signed her name with total confidence. She did not ask for permission. She did not second-guess her instincts. She owned the room completely. Looking at her, my heart swelled with a pride so profound it brought hot tears to my old eyes. The Vance family had tried to bury her. They had tried to erase her vibrant identity and turn her into a quiet, obedient accessory for their own selfish gain. But immense pressure does not destroy a diamond. It only makes it harder, sharper, and infinitely more valuable. They thought they had captured a fragile, helpless bird, They did not realize they were forging an absolute titan. Maya Jenkins was finally home, and she would never ever let another human being control her destiny again. 5 months have passed since that chaotic morning in the plaza. The suffocating summer heat has finally given way to a cool, crisp autumn breeze. I am sitting on my front porch in the old wooden rocking chair that my late wife Beatrice bought 40 years ago. I hold a warm ceramic mug of sweet tea in my hands, feeling the familiar comfort of the rough calluses on my palms. Sitting right next to me in the matching rocking chair is my beautiful daughter Maya. She is not wearing a heavy, restrictive designer dress anymore. She is wearing comfortable jeans and a simple cotton sweater, softly humming along to a soul record playing on the radio inside the house. She has a thick stack of community grant proposals resting on her lap, carefully reviewing the applications for the new small business fund we just launched. She looks peaceful. She looks incredibly free. Sometimes I sit here and think back to that lavish wedding at the Grand Hotel. I think about the crystal chandeliers, the expensive champagne, and the absolute overwhelming arrogance of the people who thought they could erase me. I think about Margaret Vance sneering at my daughter and Richard Vance drooling over my commercial deeds. They are completely gone now. The mighty Vance empire is nothing but a cautionary tale taught in corporate law classes. Their sprawling mansion was sold at a public auction to pay off federal restitution and to satisfy the remaining debts they owed to Onyx Capital. I heard through my attorney Desmond that Richard is currently working as a night shift security guard at a suburban strip mall just to pay the rent on their tiny 2-bedroom apartment. Margaret spends her days locked inside, refusing to show her face to the neighbors who used to worship her. She lost the only thing she ever truly cared about, which was her fake social status. And Preston, the golden boy who wanted to lock my daughter in a psychological prison, is sitting in a maximum security federal cell. He is learning exactly what it feels like to have absolutely zero control over his own miserable life for the next 20 years. They thought they were the apex predators of Atlanta. They thought a 72-year-old black mechanic was nothing but a convenient stepping stone, a naive fool they could easily manipulate and discard. They looked at my worn-out work boots and my faded charcoal suit, and they saw absolute weakness. They did not understand that the deepest roots grow in the darkest soil. They did not realize that true endurance is forged in fires they could never possibly survive. They wanted to teach me a lesson about power, but instead a quiet old man taught them a devastating permanent lesson about respect. I look over at Maya. She catches me staring and gives me a warm, genuine smile. The deep, heavy shadows that haunted her eyes for 10 long years are completely gone, replaced by the sharp, brilliant light of a woman who has reclaimed her entire destiny. We lost a decade to a monster, but we have the rest of our lives to make up for it. I sip my sweet tea and look out over the West End. The streetlights are buzzing to life, illuminating the historic brick buildings down the block. The neighborhood is safe, the community is thriving, and our legacy is finally secure. I have learned a lot of things in my 72 years on this earth, but the last few months have cemented one absolute truth in my mind. True power does not need to be loud, and genuine wealth is not measured by the brand of your suit. When you underestimate a person based on their age, the color of their skin, or the simplicity of their lifestyle, you invite your own destruction. Greed creates a fragile illusion of control, but it blinds you to the silent strength of those who have survived storms you could not even endure. Family is never a transaction, and loyalty cannot be bought or forged. In the end, the ultimate justice is simply letting arrogant people dig their own graves with the very arrogance they weaponized against you. Did you like my story? Let me know what you would have done in my position down in the comments below. If you enjoyed this journey, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so I can keep bringing you more stories like this. Thank you so much for your sweet support. I am looking forward to reading your thoughts. See you in the next life story with love and respect.